Good morning and welcome back to day 2 of the 2022 CICD Research Summit. It was an informative and insightful day yesterday, and I want to thank all of our presenters as well as all of our participants for the questions and comments you brought to the conversation. If you had to miss a session yesterday, you can still view the recording on our event webpage. The Research Summit is really intended as a convening and conversation around complex and challenging topics. And the views expressed in these conversations are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System or CICD. And in that spirit, we really appreciate the open dialogue and exploration and conversation that we have. We closed our day yesterday with what I found to be a really informative and exciting panel of tribal leaders sharing examples of how they are identifying gaps in the data that they need to serve their communities. They are then pioneering systems to both gather the data they need and then consider research projects in the context of their communities. This morning, we're pleased to hear from one of those panelists again, Alicia L. Murphy, the Navajo Nation's first ever full-time economist, will launch our day with a presentation on indigenizing economic research. Alicia is the vice chair of the board of directors of the Global Center of Indigenomics, a platform for collaboration among Indigenous entrepreneurs, and is one of the 2021 National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development Native American 40 Under 40 inductees. As the first ever economist for the Navajo Nation, Alicia is working to establish strategies and practices for primary data collection and analysis that will continuously provide crucial information needed for policymaking by Navajo leadership. So thank you again for the interest, insights, and questions you're bringing to our time together. And I'll now turn it over to Navajo Nation's economist, Alicia L. Murphy, to kick us off for day 2. The floor is yours, Alicia.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Alicia Murphy, and I'm originally from Crown Point, New Mexico. I am the current economist for the Navajo Nation Division of Economic Development, and I've been in this position for a year now, and it's been awesome to be in this space to learn, to have these, to have a group of mentors and colleagues that are also just as eager to explore these questions and look into different ways to help our communities, but first by gathering data and analyzing data that is coming from our own entities, our own tribal entities. So I wanted to start off a little bit with how I started and what my journey was like coming into economics. My background is in social work. I went to school at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces with the intent to go into the social work program. I really, really loved it because in some way I wanted to help my community and I wanted to be of service to the public, and social work just seemed like a good fit at that time. I did get my bachelor's in social work. After that, I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and I went for my master's in social work. And it was there where I learned about socioeconomic development. It's a class, and that was actually the concentration in my program. And in that class, one of the last classes of my last semester, I learned how data was used to tell the stories of communities, and how data was used to track trends and to look at, it was just a different way to look at our communities and find solutions using data. So that was the transition into economics. But again, as a student, it was always a goal of mine to return to my tribal community to work and help in some way. And I found myself in these programs overwhelmed with research projects and papers that would result in a grade. And as I progressed, I was feeling the pull to produce work that would be helpful, that would be impactful for my community, and it wouldn't be just for a grade. So that mindset changing and the maturity of how I was approaching academics, it also was apparent to me that it was becoming, for a student, a tribal student in a what do they call it? I was the only Native student within the program at New Mexico State and at Washington University in St. Louis. And it was becoming more apparent that I had to find a way to connect the academic world to how, and to explore the ways my tribal communities needed these issues addressed or needed to change something. But it was just an awesome time. It was also frustrating. And through that frustration, I found my passion in exploring economics and how that would help to find solutions to those questions. So I found myself in that space, and still with the intent and the goal to go back to my communities and work. So then my academics turned into, how do I change this research? How am I going to make this research impactful to not the Navajo Nation, but like just my community of Crown Point, New Mexico, or to my family? How can I make this very nerdy academic-y research be helpful to my family and help them understand or be interested in the same questions I'm asking, because it will impact them at some point or another. So it was always a struggle to be the first or the only Native student in a program or in a class, and then have these questions come up, and nobody in my cohort or in my immediate surroundings were facing the same issues, and persevered through that, and frustration through kind of drove me to continue to push through these obstacles, these hurdles of connecting research and trying to always bring it back to home. My home was where I wanted to be. And being a student in that time was difficult, because I wasn't validated in my research topics. I wasn't until I brought these conversations to home, and it felt like it was going to be helpful. And that's unfortunate, but I think things are changing now, as conversations back at home or conversations in my university with my mentors there, who are awesome and great, and were open to questions and open to even accepting that they don't know it all. That was a transition, and I think it was needed. So it's not going to stay the same, and I know it's going to change over time. But I found myself in that transition, as well as trying to find my passion in economics and continue to learn. So so essentially I went from a macro perspective in these socioeconomic issues in the academic world, and where we don't have that, the majority of our society does not understand the sovereignty status of our tribal communities. So taking all of that in and understanding that we have significant and intangible cultural values, language, and customs that account for our entire identity, and finding a way to put that in research and make it impactful for where I was going in the future. So at the time, I was in the social work program. I graduated and then came back to New Mexico State, and I entered into the Master's of Economics program. Dealt with those same, I was the only Native in the program, and continued to go through it because I knew there was something greater at the end of it. If just had to get through these classes. So the challenge was still there. How do I continue to take economics and make it helpful for my families? And so I had to translate my papers and my research and communicate those with my family. They're smart, they're intelligent and insightful, and they have the experience of their careers behind them. And then I approached them with these research ideas that involved data tracking and regional data analysis and regressions. To me, it's important that I am able to write and produce work that is communicative to those family members that I often think about and turn to for mentorship, for guidance. So more now, my question is, how do I provide these reports to be helpful, to inform policy and create positive changes that help my community to reach its full potential? How do I do this in the position that I'm in now? And I'm also still a doctorate student with the New Mexico State. I'm working on my doctorate in economic development. So I still have room to play and have my foot in two different roles, as a doctorate student and as the economist here. And I'm still dealing with that transition, and I feel like it's a benefit to me, because these questions I get from my doctorate committee, I bring back to my work here, and then vice versa. And the more I can explore, the better I feel like I can come up with these creative solutions that are going to carry on for the duration of my projects I have going on now, and for paving the way to achieving data sovereignty in this position now. So today, my goal is to start our own data repository that will securely hold our nation's important data sets, that will be accessible to our leaders and policymakers, and overall be a service to our citizens of the Navajo Nation. And I truly believe that data tells the stories of our communities, and it's time for our community and our tribal communities to tell our own stories using our own data. For sound and truly reflective data that encompasses the identity of all of our communities near and far, we absolutely have to have the input of our community to tell those stories. So in my upcoming work, in the very near future, I spoke about yesterday, I will incorporate community input to help define what economic development is for our nation, for Navajo Nation. What community sees as the true indicators of success, the true measurements of those indicators. For example, I grew up knowing that money wasn't the end all be all. It doesn't tell you how successful you are because you have lots of money. It's your character, it's how you serve your communities and how you lift up everyone. And that's a true definition of wealth. Or in another sense, the ownership of land is your definition of wealth, or your ownership of a flock of sheep or your cattle, that's your definition of wealth. So in all parts of Navajo Nation, we have our own definitions, and it is going to be my work and my focus for the next coming year that we want to define what economic development really is. And from then going forward, we can utilize this data that we're gathering to tell our story. We have coming through COVID, we've had a boost in our population or our tribal enrollment, and we want to be able to tell their story and what has come from such a tragic point in our time. What can we utilize to not reshape, but to focus and highlight our communities in different ways. So I think right now, as I've come on board and I've taken this year to observe what our tribal government, how it operates and how we communicate or not communicate, I've learned a lot in this year. And I feel like it's prepared me to push forward in highlighting what's working and what's not working, what needs to change and what doesn't need to change. Even being a part of this conference, I'm learning of the work that other tribes are doing, and could pull from that and make it work for different parts of our projects here. And so I hope that with the work that I speak about, or the questions I'm able to pose in my participation here in this conference, that it's only going to ignite this fire that we have to achieve data sovereignty. So when we go forward today, and I see a lot of good presentations coming up, and I look forward to learning more from our tribal professionals in the same field. I think I'd just like to close by saying that right now, the Navajo Nation Division of Economic Development is in sort of a paradigm shift, where we want to hear directly from our small businesses, our Navajo business owners, our artisans, and they are the economy that's been active before COVID, during COVID, and it's really becoming the movement behind our economy, and we have so many opportunities to collect data and utilize that information to then apply the resources that we can acquire to their service, like and ignite and continue to empower the work that they're doing. And my focus for the next couple of weeks and the next couple of months is to continue to fine-tune the plan I have for data collection and starting a data repository, and making sure that community input is at the forefront of all of these conversations, because that is our economy. And so thank you so much to the Center for Indian Country Development for the invitation to speak today and to be a part of the panel yesterday. I am grateful and honored. And I again, like I say, I'm so excited for this topic and all of the topics, because it's not spoke about enough, and I think about this all the time. So I'm really, really happy to hear of and to be a part of this research summit. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Alicia, and I appreciate giving the keynote presentation for this conference. It was a great presentation, and it's great that you're bringing academic ideas back to your community, so keep up the great work. I do have to transition from the keynote to the next presentation in the next set of sessions. So our first session, we'll have 3 in a row. The first one is from 10:20 Central Time to 10:50 Central Time. And it's our student paper session. So each year the CICD likes to give either undergraduate or graduate students the stage to present some of their research that pertains to American Indian, Alaska Native Hawaiian communities, just indigenous communities as a whole. This year, our presenter is Alene Tchourumoff. Elliot is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota Applied Economics Department. He's also a research assistant at the CICD, and he'll present research on using alternative data to study reservation economies. The discussant will be Dick Todd. Dick is a retired economist from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis in the Center for Indian Country Development. We're very grateful of all the work Dick has done to create connections that we still use today at the CICD. So thank you, Dick, for all your great work. And in Dick's free time, he is teaching an Indigenous economics class through the Applied Economics Department at the University of Minnesota. If you know of students who are on this call or you know of students at the U, please take Dick's course. So with that said, I'll turn things over to Elliot.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Matt, for the introduction. My name is Alene Tchourumoff. I am an enrolled member of the Lacti Flammable Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Today, I'll be discussing some research that my co-authors, Matt, Greg, and Alice Zhang have put together on using alternative data to study reservation economies. So before I get too far into this, I just want to throw out our disclaimer that the views that are expressed in this presentation, they're the views of the authors, and they're not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So getting into the motivation of this research. So there's always sort of like this data scarcity and these data issues that we face when we're interested in answering questions of economics related to Indian country. Federal surveys, they require oversampling to identify economic conditions of small groups. So this becomes an issue when you're trying to look at a small group such as American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, or other Pacific Islanders. It's very hard to gauge the current economic conditions of reservations because you may want to use the American Community Survey, and the most recent data set is from 2016 through 2020. So this sort of data scarcity issue leads into having to find alternative data sets or getting very creative with the sort of data that you get. So we have turned to the SafeGraph data, and SafeGraph they have several data products, but in this presentation, we're only looking at two of them, SafeGraph Patterns and SafeGraph Spend. SafeGraph Patterns is a large panel of individuals whose cell phone locations are tracked. So we can study visitation, where people are traveling. And then SafeGraph Spend is a data set that has debit and credit card transactions for a large sample of establishments. So when we began this research and learning more about SafeGraph data, there is a lot of questions that we can answer with these data sets. And generally, we're kind of like trying to answer 3 general questions right now. And the research is preliminary. We're looking for feedback on these questions, but these questions are fairly broad right now, and they'll get more narrow over time. But the first question we're asking is, how far do people that reside on reservations, how far do they have to travel to get goods and services? The second set of questions is we're kind of getting at the inflows and the outflows of business activity, but it asks where do consumers living on reservations go to buy goods and services? So are residents on reservations, are they traveling nearby reservations, or are they traveling off the reservation to purchase food, or maybe getting access to healthcare? And the third bucket of questions is we're in a pandemic. The pandemic began in 2020. How did the pandemic affect these travel patterns and spending patterns to industries that are located on reservations? And then we can sort of compare these travel patterns and these spending patterns to reservations and off reservation. So just to kind of give a brief summary of what we have found so far, we find that individuals living on reservations have to travel for very long distances for consumer goods. We find that there's large flows of individuals who travel from reservations to off-reservation establishments. And somewhat on the opposite side of that, we also find that there's a large inflow of individuals who live off of reservations, and they actually come to the reservation to shop. And with respect to SafeGraph Spend, we find that average spending with specific industries is substantially higher throughout 2020 compared to spending of the same industries located near reservations in the rest of the US. So I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what these data sets are. This is a very, very broad overview, but these are the variables and sort of the analysis that we're doing. So the SafeGraph places and patterns data, it collects and aggregates weekly visits to points of interest for mobile devices. So a point of interest is a business. It can also be like a park. Individuals are anonymized. We can't identify an individual, and differential privacy is applied to home locations. So we don't exactly know specifically where users that are in the SafeGraph dataset, we don't know like their exact address or anything like that. We focus on 2020. This lets us capture a bit of time before the pandemic began, and then we're getting data throughout the pandemic. This data, the SafeGraph dataset, captures about 5% of all smartphones in the USA. So in order for SafeGraph to collect data, users have to download an app, and then the app collects this data, and then it's shared with SafeGraph. Just a little bit on the data and the variables that we're using. So visitation counts, we have visitation counts for over 7 million POIs. Of those 7 million POIs, we find that about 15,000 are located on reservations. We know the exact location of POIs. We have the coordinates. We know the industry type for POIs, and we kind of know the home location for visitors. So it's linked to the census block group level, which is the smallest geographical unit that Census publishes data on, at least publicly. So a bit about SafeGraph spend. This contains anonymized monthly based transactions data. This is collected from debit and credit card transactions. We can figure out the average transaction size. We have a little bit of information on customer demographics. And this data set begins in 2020. It goes to July 2022. And of the POIs from this data set, about 2,000 of them are located on reservations. Just talking a bit about how we're setting up our research and our research methods. So we say that a business is located on a reservation just outside of a reservation, which is about 10 kilometers away from a reservation boundary, or outside of this border, which is basically just everything else. As I said earlier, we do not know the exact location of a visitor. So we kind of have to do some inference and make some assignment rules. So for this, we are calling a census block that has over 50% of its overlap is reservation, and we're calling that reservation. So because of this, most census blocks that we call reservations, they're completely contained within reservation boundaries. And then for the spend data, we have the exact locations of the businesses, so we can just determine whether or not it's on a reservation. Just talking about a little bit more about the analysis and the data variables that we're actually pulling out. We find the average distance traveled for visitors to several types of businesses based on industry types. So we can see how far they're traveling to grocery stores, restaurants, gas stations and convenience stores, department stores and banks. Those are kind of like the broad categories that we're focused on. And then we compare distances based on where residents are from. So if they're on a reservation, nearby a reservation, or the rest of the United States. And we also study spillover of economic activity. So this is like the inflows and outflows. And we find the share of visitors to reservation businesses who traveled from off-reservation census areas. So we call this an inflow of business activity. And then we find the share of individuals that reside on reservations who travel off-reservation POIs. And we've been calling this outflow of business activity. And then lastly, this comes from SafeGraph spend. We get to see the variation in spending for gas stations and convenience stores before and during the initial year of the pandemic. So this is the first result that we have. So if we look at the left-hand side, these are like the industry types. So we have restaurants, grocery stores, department stores, gas stations, commercial banks. We have the sample size of the POIs that are located on these type of industries on reservations. And then we have the distances for residents of reservations, near reservation in the rest of the United States. And with this figure, or this table, I kind of want to highlight two things. For grocery stores, for example, we're seeing that residents on reservations travel about 44 miles, which is a bit more than the rest of the United States. We're observing about 29 miles. And then for like commercial banks, we're seeing for on-reservation residents, they're traveling about 34 miles. And then for the rest of the United States, it's 22. So there's a few other results here that we can talk about later, but the data is there. So here is a figure that shows the average trip distance to grocery stores during 2020. And on the y-axis, we have average trip distance in miles. It's a 4-week rolling average. So The weekly patterns data, it's weekly, and we're basically averaging and creating like a monthly variable. So from this, we can see that, around when the pandemic began, through April and March, we're seeing that people are traveling not as far for both residents of reservations and the rest of the United States. The on-reservation residents are shown with the square line that's blue, and then the rest of the United States is the teal line with triangles. And we also see somewhat of a gap that seems to be persistent throughout the year. So this table is getting at the inflows of business activity. So when people are traveling to reservation establishments, where are they coming from? So some of the numbers here that I think are important to emphasize are, if you look at commercial banks, we can see that there's somewhat of like a local need here, is that, of the visits for on-reservation residents, they're coming from the reservation. And then for grocery stores, it's 38%. Compared to the rest of the United States, it's 20%. So, yeah. This next table that we have is it's basically asking, so where do individuals or people residing on reservations, where do they go when they visit industries? So among residents from reservations who went and visited this particular industry. So again, here we can see that banks, so residents from reservations, 38% of them went to reservation banks, 38% of them went to nearby banks, and then 23% of them went to banks that were located off of the reservation. Another sort of important number to highlight here is department stores. So what we're seeing is that residents from reservations, that they travel to nearby, just adjacent to the reservation, or to the rest of the United States. Here is a figure that comes from SafeGraph Spend. On the y-axis, what we have is we have average spending in 2020 constant dollars. Again, the blue series, the navy blue, it probably looks like black, but the squares are on reservation spending for an on-reservation business, and then the gold and the teal are near and off-reservation spending at gas stations and convenience stores. So there are two things to notice with this figure. The first is there seems to be a persistent gap between on-reservation spending and off-reservation spending of about $15. Anecdotally, we hear a lot of stories about people having to spend more to purchase goods on reservations, and maybe that's coming through here, but we can't actually distinguish between price and quantity effects. So we don't know if people are just buying more things, or if high prices are driving this gap. The other thing to notice is there's a general rise in the basket, or the average spending for everybody, and it is gas stations and convenience stores, and it's probably driven by energy prices. So yeah, those are some early results from our research. I hope this is informative. Kind of had to blaze through that. In the future, some additional things that we're trying to do is, because all the data, we have census block groups, we can merge in a lot of additional information from the government. We can get some data from CDC. Maybe we can merge in like life expectancy and look at healthcare access. We can merge in data on socioeconomic indicators such as income levels for census block groups, poverty levels. We can use like a USDA definition for a food desert to kind of learn more about grocery store access. And then there is like a question that I would find interesting, but that I won't be investigating, But you might be able to find out like the distance that people are having to travel to go to voting locations. So thank you all, and that is everything that I got for now.
Thanks, Elliot. You covered a lot of information in a short period of time, which is no small order. So thanks. Dick Todd will be discussing.
I'm very happy to be here. I've enjoyed the whole conference. And it's also great to be part of the student presentation. Had our first two presenters so far have both been young Indigenous PhD students in the social sciences. That's great to see. I'm honored to be part of that. I'm sitting here at home in St. Paul on traditional Dakota lands. I find this paper quite interesting. I think it's going to be a useful approach. So in many ways, I just want to cheerlead and ask for more, but of course, my role is also to make some comments. So I will do that. And really enjoy here being working with the CICD again. So as an overview, I would say, again, I really like the work. Is my screen partly cut off on the right? Is that, let's see, what have I got? Kind of a problem now with the wrong, there we go. But I'm going to raise some questions about the data set. What does it really measure, and some implications for privacy and data sovereignty. I'm going to then try to link some of the findings that were presented in some interesting detail, but I want to link them to broader literature. I think that will help. So I think you're really working on the one hand in a vein of a tradition of analyzing weak spots in either tribal or rural economies where people talk about deserts and leakage and things like that. On the flip side of that, that implies some opportunities. You're also in a vein of maybe looking at some strengths of these economies too, where people talk about positive spillovers. I think if you can link to some of the rural and reservation literature on things like claims of leakage and access and problems and claims of wanting to demonstrate positive spillovers, you find maybe a little bit easier to put some of your results into context. I'll close with a few comments on further research. So I do have some questions about the data set, and I hope, when there's a paper and you write this up, that a lot of this will be explained. But I have questions about what's exactly being measured. I think the details you provide say that they count a visit if someone is in the near vicinity of a point of interest for like a minute. And that's pretty good, but to some extent it could just be someone lingering there, not really visiting. So there's some question of how accurate the visit data is. I think implicitly you must be also able to measure not just retail visits, but basically workplaces. So you can look at commuting patterns. That was something I didn't hear any talk about, but I think you could. And things like daycare usage and school attendance, driving kids to school to some extent. It wasn't clear to me on your visiting data, do you see just a yes, no, that someone went to a POI during a week, or do you see actually the number of visits per week? That would be a dimension that might be interesting. And I'd like to know more about the spending data in general and how they're linked to the visit data. I do have a question about representativeness. You said there's roughly 5% of cell phones, people download this app. Are the people who download that app, this 5%, are they representative sample of cell phone holders? Or is this group of cell phone holders skewed in some way that makes your data less than fully representative? It'd be good to know more about that. Yeah, I think on the data sovereignty question, I'm going to skip the issues about precision on your geographic location. We can talk about that separately, but I do have I think this is interesting, both from the privacy and data sovereignty point of view. From privacy, you mentioned the differential privacy they use. I don't fully understand it. I had a question of, suppose it's well known by people in the area that so-and-so has a fairly unique commuting pattern, going from a block group home to a certain let's say off-reservation workplace. Would it be possible to identify them on that basis? I'd like to know more about that. And And then on data sovereignty, I think this kind of big data raises a lot of questions. Yesterday, Kevin Washburn referred to tribes both wanting to control data and working to partner and share data. Those are two different approaches. Jonathan Taylor picked up on that and spoke of tribes in the census co-managing data. And I kind of agree with this sharing perspective that it's going to be relevant for data sets like this. I think these data sets illustrate that the paradigm of private property and traditional economic goods is not always adequate for thinking about the ownership of data and information. I think we may want to look at some almost traditional indigenous ideas for control and ownership when we talk about data. You know, tribes, I think, were very good at managing common pool resources. Ron Trosper has talked about indigenous relationship goods. I think that tribes need to draw on those traditions to have a broader dialogue with society in general that is struggling over how to manage these big data resources, who really controls them. So I'd put a plug in for that. Turning now to, you know, some of the specifics of the analysis. Again, I said one thing you're kind of doing ties into an old literature in regional econ of identifying gaps or access problems, so-called spending leakage. I think you need to tie into that literature and kind of put some of your results under that framework. As you do so, consider which metrics, a broader array of metrics perhaps. Right now you're focusing a lot on the miles per trip, and I think that's a good start. But you know, there are some other metrics you could consider. You could look at travel time, frequency of trips, evidence that some groups of people group their visits more than others. In other words, they make one trip with a lot of stops versus making multiple trips. That could be relevant for if there's a large distance, evidence of carpooling, etc. I would also point out that, you know, 2020 was a pretty unusual year for shopping. So it's both interesting, but also not necessarily representative. You're using these near reservation areas that are very near, they're almost just bordering areas, narrow bordering areas as your comparisons right now. Probably want to do some sensitivity analysis on that. Think of other possible comparison areas as well. And a big point for me would be that I think I'd like to see more on the range of experience among reservations. You're presenting averages and the standard deviations are helpful, but I think there are some real problems with extreme experiences between reservations. I'd like to see a broader exploration of the full range of the distribution. I suggest, you know, maybe using some box and whisker plots to show some of these extremes if you can. The results on this, I think, are going to be useful. I think they may show that some kinds of point of interest are strongly affecting travel patterns. I'm not sure if that's the takeaway, the gasoline spending graph or not. It wasn't clear, but I think you might be able to identify points of interest that, you know, whose presence or absence really strongly affects the ability of a reservation to retain and grow its population and its economy. So again, same kind of thing, but now flipping to analyzing strengths, which I think you maybe didn't emphasize as much, although a little bit when you talked about the tourists. But there's been a big interest in tribes in understanding better and measuring their spillover, their positive spillovers from the reservation to the region around them. I think you should tie into those interests in that literature. You can use the 2020 closure of casinos as a sort of experiment to see what happens to visits all throughout the region. We sometimes refer to those as natural experiments, and I guess COVID was very natural, but it's also, from a data point of view, a very unnatural year, but nonetheless, you can make use of it with a lot of caveats. I think you could maybe also look at other instances of points of interest either showing up in the data or disappearing as this data set accumulates over time, and what impact that has. In more normal years, other than 2020, I think you can use some other metrics besides you know, travel distance and stuff. I'd like to see more again on the clustering of outsiders' visits to the region and other points of interest. How do tourists group their visits? They go to the casino, what else do they go to in the region? Things like that. That again can inform economic development responses. You might find, for example, that there are clusters of POIs that tourists visit. That could lead to some cooperation between tribal governments and regional officials on tourist development and tourist marketing. I have a personal bias toward wanting to know a lot more about how medical facilities affect travel patterns too. So I'd encourage you to go examine that. But these are, again, tie into the literature on an interest in measuring spillovers. As far as some ideas on additional research, I think it'd be a little bit interesting to see if you can use your weekly timing data to look for signs of financial stress. Do you see that visits to food stores vary more within a month, maybe in reservations and elsewhere? Are the big shopping trips that involve food stores clustered around the dates of Social Security payments or per capita payments? With regard to car dealers, are we seeing a clustering of visits at tax rebate season? So these would be signs perhaps of financial constraints. And again, I'm putting in this plug for looking at the medical facilities. I guess I would also add, as I listened to making a few notes, listening to the presentation, talked about the pandemic impact with the casinos. Over time, you should also be able to find maybe some weather or other natural disaster events that would be interesting to study. There's just a lot of ways to go with this data. And I hope over time that your work on the leakage and that sort of access gaps on reservations will help reservation entrepreneurs identify both good business opportunities in terms of the type of business they might want to invest in, as well as good locations for more businesses on reservations using your travel pattern data. So I think I want to keep on time. I'll close there.
Thanks, Dick. This session has effectively ended. However, there's a couple questions in the chat. If Elliot, if you could answer them. There are two, Dick and Kim in the chat are interested in healthcare services. So in 30 seconds, does SafeGraph data contain healthcare clinics, general hospitals, etc.?
Yeah, so we did calculate distances for healthcare services, and we didn't report them in this presentation because we were mostly looking at the good side. Yeah, we calculated distances, and we did notice some gaps. In particular for like outpatient healthcare, the distances for on-reservation residents was fairly large, the gap, but yeah, we've looked into that. So
okay, great. Well, thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Dick. Appreciate your presentation and comments.
Thanks, Dick.
Good to see you, Elliot. Thanks.
For this next panel, we have 40 minutes to talk about opportunities and challenges of home ownership on trust land. We have two panelists, and I will just moderate the Q&A. I'm very invested in this topic as well, so I look forward to this presentation. The panelists are Mel Willey. Mel is the Director of Native Strategies at NeighborWorks America, and Steve Barbier, who's the Senior Relationship Manager, of the Western region of NeighborWorks America. I've learned a lot from both Mel and Steve, much more than they've learned from me, but I always appreciate their thoughts. They are thought leaders in this space, and look forward to the next 40 minutes of discussion. They'll start with a presentation, and then when the presentation is over, after 20 or so minutes, we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll just lead the Q&A. So with that said, Mel and Steve, who will present jointly the slide deck, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate the opportunity to present today. We are very thankful for the partnership that NeighborWorks America has with the Center for Indian Country Development. And we appreciate the discussions that we have and to sharing our knowledge, and appreciate the invitation to be here today. So the title of our presentation is the panel discussion on opportunities and challenges of homeownership on trust land. But we also wanted to talk about the full range of land types in Indian country. So that will also be included, and also some broad-based strategies that NeighborWorks is implementing, and some of the best practices that we are providing, and then just kind of our overall view of some of the issues in the state of Indian nations housing. So one thing that I think that this group is probably well aware of is that just the sheer amount of diversity that exists in Indian country. There are 574 American Indian and Alaska Native tribes in the United States. And with those different tribes, there's different types of land types. We first have the tribal trust, which is about 66 million acres held in trust. And trust land is the US government holds legal title to the trust land for the benefit of federally recognized Indian tribes or Indian tribal members. So this is the land that we're most in discussion about the challenges that we have in housing development. Also within tribal trust land, there's also allotted and also allotted fee simple land, but allotted land is over 10 million acres belonging to individual Indians. And allotted lands are those lands that can be held in trust or restricted fee status. These lands stem from treaties and allotment statuses that divided land communally held by tribes and allotted parcels to individual tribal members. The definitions of this is included into the downloaded slide deck that's available to you. Next, we have the restricted fee. We have about 2.5 million acres across the United States of restricted fee Indian land. Restricted fee land refers to land to which a tribe or individual tribal member holds legal title, but the title is subject to restrictions by the United States against alienation, the sale or transfer, or encumbrance. And last, we have the fee simple, which is the 1.6 million acres. And fee simple lands are lands previously conveyed out of tribal ownership that are freely alienable and can be encumbered without federal approval. These lands can be owned by non-Indians and may be purchased or owned by a tribe or an individual tribal member. We note here that there's about 36 states that have Indian trust or restricted lands, fee simple land, and typically included in an Indian area. One thing that we also want to know is that while we do experience a lot of homeownership issues on tribal trust land in those areas, that about 70% of the American Indian population lives outside of the statistical areas that are defined as Indian statistical areas. But that's another discussion for another day, talking about the issues of homeownership in urban areas. One thing that we wanted to talk about was in 2017, the Indian Housing Needs Study was conducted. This was conducted by HUD, and they did a comprehensive study to look at the Indian housing needs. This study revealed that there's about 68,000 new units that are needed in Indian country. But that number only reflects those units, 35,000 that are needed to alleviate some of the dilapidated units or substandard homes, but another 33,000 to look at the overcrowded conditions. There's a number of tribes that have noted, have done their own studies, and there's also regional studies that are conducted, but this is the most comprehensive study that's done to look at the Indian housing needs across the United States. And looking at those two areas of substandard homes and overcrowded conditions, we come out with the number of 68,000. And fiscal year 2021, we want to know is that that's such a huge amount of need. And in fiscal year 2021, it was reported that to Congress that only 346 units, newly constructed or acquired, were developed through the Indian Housing Block Grant funding. The Indian Housing Block Grant funding is a funding that's provided through the Native American, or made available through the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, commonly referred to as NAHASDA. NAHASDA was passed in 1996, went into full effect in 1999, and is the single largest investment of federal funding for the housing needs within Indian country. It's been basically in flatline appropriations since, and it's been very difficult because as this housing needs study revealed is that a lot of the money that's going into tribal housing programs, that a lot of the money is used to modernize the existing housing units. And if you're a housing practitioner, you know that it's just not about building the house, but also modernizing and keeping the upkeep, especially for our rental units. And so there's very little as far as new money left over for the construction of newly constructed and acquired units. So at this pace, addressing the substantial need for new units can only be achieved through accessing private investment. This is a great graphic that's provided by Big Water Consulting. They're doing a number of housing needs across regional housing needs studies across the United States. But this graphic shows how the steady since 1998, funding allocations for the Indian Housing Block Grant have remained constant. However, inflation has decreased the buying power. And so what is the results of flatline funding? One of the cons that we see is that, as I explained before, new development decreases while maintenance of rehab of older units increases. So there's a great opportunity that's identified here because tribes are seeking to leverage their IHBG funds. NeighborWorks America is proud to provide a housing and financial capabilities study. This was done in 2022. They took over a survey of 1,806 American adults. This survey was conducted from April 28th to May 16th, 2022, and here are some of the results. And you'll see that as far as Native Americans versus the rest of the American populace, that their belief that homeownership is important is about level. It's the same 89%. But the number of Native Americans that own a home is lower than the rest of the United States at 52%. What's important to note here is that today, a very large proportion of Native Americans are looking for new places to live, but many lack important credit building tools that could expand their options. These are the three little graphics that show that Native Americans looking for a new place to live. There's about 51% of Native Americans looking for a new place to live, as opposed to 36% across the United States. But this also shows that Native Americans, those Native Americans that have a checking account, it's only 63%, as opposed to the rest of the United States being at 80%. And then those Native Americans that have a credit card is at 50%, as opposed to the 67% nationwide. Shows that there's a need for interest into getting into homeownership, but that there's still, the Native American populace still lacks in being credit worthy and mortgage ready. There's a lack of credit is one of the reasons why many Native Americans are concerned about their ability to meet the important financial milestones. This graphic is one that's really important, and it shows a large number. And one of the numbers that I want to point out is this 80% of non-owners don't think banks or credit unions will approve them for a mortgage. And that's a huge number that we're looking at. So we see that Native Americans, for whatever reasons, don't feel like the banks or credit unions or financial institutions are going to be able to give them a loan, and that they're going to be able to get approved. But one thing that I see on this also at the final number there is that the 66% say they could use guidance on acquiring and effectively using credit. So this tells us that there's still a large, strong interest and an opportunity to provide further services within the Native American community. We wanted to outline and share some ways we put together this graphic. Steve Barbier's put together, and I kind of fine-tuned it, but it's here showing the ways in which you can help homeownership in Indian country. Of course, the first little line item there is direct lending. There's the traditional mortgage products that are provided. There's the federal guaranteed home loans and the federally guaranteed construction and development loans. These can all flow through to the individual families. But there's also this tribal housing programs in Indian country. The tribal housing authorities or the tribal housing programs do take a larger role in creating the housing stock. And so there's federally guaranteed construction and development loans that can go directly to the tribal housing programs, and those in turn create new housing stock for the tribal members. There's also secondary mortgage market acquisition that's available. There's investments that can be made through the low-income housing tax credit, the new market tax credit, the Community Reinvestment Act. There's different opportunities for investments there. There's also those ways in which providing direct investments, whether they're to tribally owned or native serving organizations. Those include like our native CDFIs, the different nonprofits that are doing homeownership education, NeighborWorks and other organizations. I'm going to turn the time over to Steve, who's going to go over our next slide.
Thank you, Mel. Mortgage lending on tribal trusts and restricted lands has only been around for about 25 years. The Presidential One-Stop Mortgage Initiative report in 1998 to 2000 included a framework or a legal infrastructure for the documents that were included as an interagency model for residential leases, model tribal mortgage codes, and model MOUs that are designed to work with HUD, USDA, and VA loan products. This particular chart, although it's probably a little hard to read, is a listing of the loan products that are or could be available in tribal communities, depending on whether or not a tribe has negotiated an agreement with a particular federal agency or government-sponsored enterprise. Next slide, Mel. The loan product with the largest market share by far is the HUD 184 loan guarantee product. And this product's been around since actually started in the early 90s, was restricted to tribal trust and restricted lands in the early years and expanded subsequently to a much larger part of the United States, including in some cases whole states, where a particular tribal community is declared tribal members in, throughout a state. It has, with some even more recent updated figures than we see on this particular chart, 49,000 loans, around $8 billion in investment since 1992. The most recent updates we've had is that they're up to almost 55,000 loans and $9.8 billion in total volume. When we look at fiscal year 2022, there were 3,600 loans guaranteed, of which about 441 were actually on tribal trust and restricted lands. So historically, only about 13% of this loan product that was designed to work on tribal trust and restricted lands is actually getting to tribal trust and restricted lands. Now, in fairness, Oklahoma and Alaska, which have large native populations, both represent a pretty large market share of this particular loan product, and those lands are primarily fee simple lands. It's been a great product for Native Americans to get into home ownership, but there's room for improvement in terms of getting this loan product onto tribal trust and restricted lands. It is a 100% loan guarantee for lenders, a low down payment and guarantee fee. Appraisal features include cost-based appraisals. There's no income restrictions. It utilizes private mortgage lenders for loan originations and closings. Next slide. Some of the challenges, most of which could be somewhat unique to Indian country, some more rural, for example, infrastructure and housing cost, might have more global implications for rural, but certainly are present in tribal trust and restricted lands. Lack of existing housing stock, lack of available land, lack of a mortgage industry, the industry representatives. The particular challenge that lenders will cite the most is lack of mortgage-ready buyers as a result of the environment. Mel spoke a little bit about that in references to credit. There's also a challenge around processing timelines for loan applications, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And there is general lender reticence to invest in residential lending due to unfamiliarity, concerns about volume, and transaction costs. Next slide, Mel. the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs Divisions of Real Estate Services and Land Titles and Records collectively function as a sort of an abstract title company for all transactions, all mortgage transactions in Indian country, or I should say most mortgage transactions in Indian country. Historically, over the past 25 years, time delays in approving leases, providing title status reports, for underwriting and lien position following closing, as well as environmental review of mortgage packages have been a significant barrier. In many ways have constrained mortgage loans on tribal trust lands, even discouraging some of the larger lenders from participating. But today, the Land Titles and Records Office, sometimes referred to as the LTRO, reported that during fiscal year 2022, their turnaround time for researching and recording title status reports and title documents has been running 5 to 7 days processing time. Now, that doesn't include the Division of Real Estate Services role in this process, and we're still waiting for some of those numbers. But it does show that there is capacity today, I think, to substantially improve loan processing time. Next slide. We talked earlier about sort of the lender's big concern around mortgage readiness buyers and mortgage-ready buyers and volume concerns. I think there's some opportunity. There's challenge, but there's opportunity today. Awista Corporation, the native CDFI, has become the first HUD housing counseling intermediary in the 50-year history of the HUD housing counseling program. And they have a set of subrecipients that they're training to provide comprehensive, or let's say pre-purchase counseling. There's homebuyer education curriculum, both through NAIHC and Awista's financial literacy education program, and training the trainers called Building Native Communities is working on sort of the basic progress of financial management by tribal members. So currently a challenge because we need this effort times 50. But at the same time, I think there's some progress in this area, and we continue to hopefully move forward. Mel, I'll turn the next slide to you.
Thank you, Steve. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was the innovations and best practices that are happening across Indian country to help in homeownership. And I wanted to highlight the great work of the South Dakota Native Homeownership Coalition. They're a great example of partnerships. They bring together various public and private agencies, federal, state, local, nonprofit, CDFIs, tribal housing programs, tribal housing authorities, the tribes themselves, and tribal leadership. And they have open dialogues on some of the issues and challenges that they're confronting to provide home ownership in the state of South Dakota to Native American families. One of the things that they do is they share data and information, which is critical to finding some success, but they also create strategies and they do pilot projects. So one of the pilot projects that they've launched was the 502 Relending pilot project, which has actually been very successful within their region and is actually being considered by Congress to be codified into law and to be passed through legislation. So it's available throughout Indian country. They also saw a big need for people within the industry, of construction industry. So they started the construction internship project, and they've been able to show some measurable success. If you go to their website, they have some great materials that show the success on these two programs. But one of the things that I want to point out about this coalition is with the federal tribal trust relationship, that same relationship should be extended through our state governments and our local entities. This kind of epitomizes the great trustful relationships between all of these partners in providing solutions and meeting the challenges to homeownership within the state. Steve?
Yes, thanks, Mel. In the 2016 Access to Capital and Credit for Native Communities study by Native Nations Institute for the CDFI Fund, Department of Treasury, There was a quote, which I think is, really important from the then CEO and president of Ho-Chunk Inc. A majority of the Winnebago tribe, Nebraska, housing is owned by tribal government and has income restrictions, which ironically forced our emerging middle class to leave the community to find housing. The very people who should be natural community leaders were moving to communities where housing was readily available and not participating fully in growing our economy. This particular project on Kerrigan Estates on the Navajo Nation, located just outside the tribal capital of Window Rock, is an example of empowerment and asset building through direct application of tribe self-determination. The Navajo Nation Division of Economic Development purchases parcel of fee simple land 2 miles west of the tribal capital. They master planned and mixed use development consisting of commercial space on highway frontage, a daycare center, 152 lots for sale at market rate, including 20 and plus 24 townhomes for sale. The housing units have been purchased primarily by employees in the Navajo Nation of tribal enterprises, medical, educational, and IT staff. Currently, about 98% of the projects completed. Kerrigan Estates project has a profound economic impact, not only through initial construction, but through the residual economic impact on local businesses through providing housing to working professionals in the Navajo Nation, has reduced leakage through its economy and decreased the brain drain of skilled professional workforce. Under the structure of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, the Navajo Nation has provided tribal members the ability to build assets while strengthening their individual sovereignty and personal empowerment. Mel?
Sure. I wanted to talk about a recent project that the NeighborWorks has been made an investment in. We've provided $100,000 grant to the National American Indian Housing Council to conduct research and build the capacity through the development of a curriculum and training project that will assist tribal housing programs in transitioning low-income housing tax credit units to homeownership after year 15 after the year 15 regulatory period has ended. There's approximately around 31,000 housing units across Indian country. If this is successful and tribes are able to transition these to homeownership units, this can make a huge impact into the homeownership needs throughout Indian country. The project will do the following. It'll conduct a outreach and data collection from tribal housing programs and other native housing stakeholders. They'll offer in-person cohort convening during the NEIC Legal Symposium, which is happening next week. This cohort's meeting on Monday. They're going to analyze the data to provide initial content and assess gaps in information and identify learning objectives. And then they're going to review the existing curriculum, make sure that it's developed with traditional cultural curriculum framework, and then develop a manual, PowerPoint presentation and training aids. They're hopefully going to launch this pilot curriculum during the in-person session in June of next year, and then take it on the road through the regional Indian housing associations. We wanted to provide this kind of overview of some of the best practices because it gives you an idea of some of the opportunities that different intermediaries can make to make an impact within homeownership. So I'll turn the time back over to Greg. He has some questions that he'd like to ask the panel members.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Steve. Great presentation. Yeah, I would like to facilitate the last 15 minutes or so of this panel. There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and I have some other questions as well. So in no particular order, and I might call out either Mel or Steve to answer the questions, but feel free stay off mute. If I call on Steve and Mel wants to say something, please answer as appropriate. So yeah, there's a lot of good questions in the chat, and I'm gonna start with one. I'll direct it to Mel, and Mel, I know you answered it privately, but I do want everyone to hear your answer. And the question relates to workforce needs and housing development. And the question is, do the housing needs study that you presented also include inputs related to workforce needs? In our community in the Upper Great Lakes region, we've seen a significant tightening of our housing market, which is challenging the tribe's ability to retain and attract needed workers. Mel, what are your thoughts?
No, this exactly actually goes back to the comment that that Steve brings, is this drain brain effect that happens in some tribal communities where we're not able to retain our middle to higher income Native families, and those people then in turn move out of our community, and so we can't retain the professionals that help to build our economy. This is a common issue, and I know that a number of tribes have talked about different economic development projects that the tribal council wants to put forward, but they're always stuck in providing how can we attract professionals to come back and to live. The HUD study does not have, from my understanding, take into account from that 68,000 unmet housing need. That's only to reflect the need to alleviate substandard homes and to alleviate overcrowding. I do not believe that the data includes all the waiting lists that tribes have or other data points beyond that. However, if you look at the HUD study, it's on HUD's PDNR website and also on HUD's ONAP, Office of Native American Programs website. You can get to the study, but it also has different appendices. And so in those appendices, they have some further data and information related to workforce housing. One of the things that we're watching is the Biden administration announced yesterday that there's going to be an effort to look at using different products that are available through HUD to look at professional housing in Indian country. So we'll see how that comes out, but it's something that gives us some hope with providing that need for workforce housing.
Thanks, Mel. And a gentle reminder, if you could stop sharing your screen, appreciate it. Steve, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I was going to actually say, exactly what Mel said, regarding to the opportunity, potentially, a proposal at this point to use the HUD 184 loan guarantee program for rental skilled housing, which potentially then could be, I think, a feeder for home ownership. If we can keep, tribal professionals in the community, potentially they may want to move into home ownership at some point. So excited about that.
Great. Another really good question in the chat. This is for either Steve and Mel or both. Any best practices for Native CDFIs to work as intermediaries connecting their community members to banks for some of the Native-specific mortgage products?
I can jump in on that, Matt. We were asked by the Navajo Nation back in 1995 to help create a local intermediary, which eventually became a CDFI called the Native Partnership for Housing. They have been a CDFI for many years now, and through a combination of offering homebuyer education and counseling, as well as a lending component to primarily, they do first mortgages, but they work primarily with financial institutions as sponsored entities in the HUD 184 language. So they're working with a 184 guarantee lender to originate loans. And as part of also a fee for service for sustainability of the Native CDFI, there is this opportunity to collaborate with lenders who are direct guarantee lenders. The proposed regulations offer a continuation of that prospect. They may go a step further, I think. They are proposed regulations, the ones that came out last week, but at the same time, I think they offer some real exciting opportunities. There is a requirement, they propose, the amount is not defined, but for all these 184 loans, lenders to actually outreach, market, and lend in tribal trust and restricted lands, as well as their work on fee simple lands. So not just do the easy loans, but also be in the community. Now, I think this is a great opportunity for Native CDFIs to partner with those HUD 184 guarantee lenders because the big challenge with all these loan products is a lack of boots on the ground, lack of folks with trusted relationships in the community that can be part of that loan distribution system. So, yeah, I think it's a bright time for native CDFIs. And I think, I hope we can do more training in the future around this and really see the native CDFIs emerge as, as local intermediaries for mortgage lending.
Great. Mel, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm just echoing the same what Steve said. I know that Lakota Funds, one of our network members, and also Forbands, which operates right out of Cheyenne River. They do some great jobs in partnering also with their own credit unions that they provide and getting them. They do work on the financial capability and homeownership and how's homeownership counseling work, and then they work with their credit union and other banking partners for some of those mortgage products.
Great.
But it's important to have people to walk through the process. I think that's important. And I think the question comes from someone who is a counselor, having as many points and making sure that they understand, for example, when they do have a mortgage, if it's resold, to make sure to answer those calls and also get that mail and look at it and make sure it's informed and you're responding to those people who are managing the mortgages and things.
Thanks. We have time for maybe 2 questions, and then we'd probably ask Steve and Mel to wrap things up. Here's a question directly to Mel from the chat. Mel, are there any state restrictions specific to American Indian tribal governments using LIHTC? If so, what are those restrictions?
That's why we're putting together this cohort, because as you know, state restrictions, they're different within different states and some of this other local issues, and also the way that each tribe has their different LIHTC projects. So we're putting together the cohort to look at what are the broad-based issues that exist. And from there, we can look at how we can develop curriculum and technical assistance and other things, tools to help overcome some of those challenges to moving LIHTC to homeownership.
Thanks. This question is for Steve. Steve, have you considered or evaluated the benefits of the Hearth Act? And if you don't mind, Steve, if you could try your best to explain what the Hearth Act is in less than a minute, it might be helpful for those in the audience that have not heard of it.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Yeah, the Hearth Act is a 2012 piece of legislation that is helping expedite responsible tribal home ownership. Sorry about that, it's a long title. And the Hearth Act really is an attempt to transfer the responsibility for leases from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to tribal governments. So it's a big piece, big opportunity for exercising sovereignty, I think. It allows the tribes to issue their own leases without the approval of the secretary. Now, tribes have to, they have to get their documents approved, et cetera. Most Hearth Act tribes, approved tribes, and I think there's probably 70 plus Hearth Act approvals, the majority being in small business, but there's probably 30 or so in the residential space. Most of them use the Hearth Act for leasing, and they still use the Bureau of Indian Affairs for recording. But it can expedite, the leasing process in tribal communities. So that's a big part of the home buyer, experience is, getting opportunity to the land. So it sort of removes the BIA from one piece of that process. We're seeing more and more organizations, more and more tribes, particularly in New Mexico. Seems like the Pueblos are really moving forward with the Hearth Act, starting to adopt this process for Hearth Act approvals.
Thanks, Steve. So folks in the chat are interested in the HUD needs assessment report that Mel brought up. Question for Mel: Do you think if there is another needs assessment by HUD, what would you expect to find? Do you expect to find improved situations since the last HUD report, stagnant housing development, or worse housing characteristics on tribal areas compared to that HUD report? So from what you're hearing, how would you respond to that question?
Well, that's a difficult one because as we increase the number of tribal members across the United States, then we increase the need for housing. And there's a variety of variables within the economy that impact overcrowding, impact whether we're able to get investments out there to any country. But I hope that we are able to make huge contributions within homeownership and housing, and I'm optimistic that we can. I think that this is a great time for Indian country in development. I think there's opportunities to leverage the Indian Housing Block Grant in ways more so than ever before. We have to understand that the Indian Housing Block Grant just started in 1999 and being used. We're finding new ways, and through partnerships with like the Center for Indian Country Development, the data that you guys provide, the partnerships that we have with other intermediaries, national, local, and also tribes are just coming more savvier about how they can leverage their funding. And I think there's some great opportunities for great things. One of the things that I wanted to bring out is I do think that tribes need to start making larger investments into planners and to community development planners. We did the same thing. If you know, Navajo made a huge investment into people to get people into the forest management industry. And now we are seeing those fruits come to labor because now we are seeing co-management of federal lands and national parks and things. And they saw that because we made a pipeline of our students going into the forest management industry. We need to do the same for tribal planners and people at the local level so that we can educate more of our tribal leaders and also a lot of our community members about how to plan out a community. I'd like to see larger investments in that area.
Thanks. So we've reached the end of our time. Mel did a great job wrapping up, answering the question and also providing some opportunities for greater homeownership on tribal areas and tribal communities. So Mel, if you don't mind, 30 seconds or so, what's a key takeaway? How would you like to end your presentation?
Sure, going back to that question about the worker demonstration program, Iris Friday from ONAP has published that into the question and answer section, so get that out there. But I think, again, there's some great opportunities here. I don't like to emphasize the challenges because I like to let's emphasize the opportunities of how we can look at the best practices and lessons learned and move forward to create and expand homeownership for Native families.
Great. Steve, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. As we said on one of the earlier slides, the NAHASDA is a great program, but it can't come close to meeting the housing needs in tribal communities. So we have to have private investment. And so we have to get lenders comfortable with lending in this space. We have to get tribes, more, going to the planner reference, engaged in setting aside land for home ownership, for market rate home ownership to keep those skilled workers, in the community. So, and we have to invest more in homebuyer readiness and homebuyer education to build that pipeline so that the mortgage industry, can come in at some level of scale to support, this investment. So with that, I just want to thank you, Matt, and thank Casey and the Center for Indian Country Development for allowing us to raise up this issue as part of this discussion on supporting and tribal economies. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Mel. So we're going to pivot from home ownership to the American Community Survey in our next session. So from 11:30 to 12 Central Time for, well, we're a little past, but we can make up this time. We're going to have a presentation by Jeff Burnett. Jeff is a professor at Rochester Institute of Technology. Jeff is going to present work titled Patterns of Uncertainty, Inaccuracy, and Statistical Erasure. I'm the moderator, so I will manage the Q&A. Jeff's discussant is Ray Foxworth. Ray is president of First Nations Development Institute. And just a reminder that these views that will be presented here are not necessarily those of the CICD or the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. We are critical of census products because of their importance. So with that said, I will turn the floor over to Jeff.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm on the East Coast here, Eastern time, so it's afternoon for me. Good morning to everyone else who's not in the Eastern time zone. I just want to say it's really an honor and to be able to present here today. I've just seen so many wonderful speakers, and so with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen and just get going. Basically, the thing that I'm focused in on is the American Community Survey educational tabulation. And this is a data set that's relatively recent, but it speaks to a little bit of a larger issue of the lack of data and the lack of knowledge about data quality for American Indian Alaska Natives. And so I'm sure a number of people here are keenly aware that the National Congress of American Indians has raised this issue before, that the data for American Indian Alaska Natives and its reliability is oftentimes replaced with an asterisk or not reported at all. And so we're often referred to as the asterisk nation. And this is something that we know exists, but there isn't a lot of documentation on this. And so this is kind of my first stab at this. The way that I got about this is the Johnson O'Malley Modernization Act of 2019, and looking at the need for government to come up with an estimate for the American Indian Alaska Native K-12 population. And the idea was, well, let's look at the total number of students that are out there. And then the thing is, each individual school district and area needs to have some sort of estimate for how many students are within it. And the Johnson O'Malley Modernization Act required the Bureau of Indian Education to prepare a report assessing or coming up with an estimate for this population. And they recommended the American Community Survey educational tabulation. So that's what got me onto that. So while I was working with it, I noticed that there were a bit of different issues, but because I've also worked with the Common Core of Data, I said, well, maybe I might be able to get a little bit of a better understanding of how this data might be accurate or what is the variation in this. So the American Community Survey educational tabulation does disaggregate amongst a number of different categories for the K-12 population. Here, I'm just going to focus everything on non-Hispanic, single race white, non-Hispanic, single race American Indian, only because of the fact that that's what is reported in the Common Core of Data. I'm ultimately going to use kind of two different techniques to come up with estimates of reliability and accuracy, the coefficient of variation and the mean absolute percentage error. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this from some different geographies, the United States as a whole, inside and outside American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian homeland areas, majority American Indian, Alaska Native areas, and areas where American Indian, Alaska Native students make up the second majority population. But I'm keenly interested in these issues of statistical erasure. And because of that, I'm really going to delve into some of those areas where the American Community Survey educational tabulation says there are no American Indian Alaska Native students, but we know that there are some because they pop up in the Common Core of data. So just a little bit about the American Community Survey educational tabulation. It's part of the Educational Demographic and Geographic Estimates Program. It was introduced in 2015, and it provides estimates at the school district level. It's published in using 5-year samples. The whole idea behind it is to provide data at the school district level, so that way local communities can use this information, presumably to write grants, demonstrate need, and that sort of stuff. But the issue is accuracy within it is largely dependent upon sample size. Whereas Common Core of Data, this is an administrative data set. So everybody who attends a public school ends up providing information on their child to attend that school, and then that information is then reported to the National Center for Education Statistics. All public school districts report this data, and there can be some errors in reporting, collecting this data, but essentially you have a census of the number of students that are out there that are single race, non-Hispanic. Again, neither of these data sets do anything that touch with whether or not students are citizens of federally recognized tribes. Common Core data itself is published annually, and so you have relatively recent and current data on a regular basis. So what I've put up here now is just your national statistics. How many students are there in the Common Core data? How many students are there in the American Community Survey educational tabulation? And what we see is, in many respects, for percentages, the numbers are pretty close, whether they're American Indian, Alaska Native, or white, or the American Community Survey educational tabulation at a national level does have some errors in it. I mean, there's a margin of error built into this, but from a percentage wise, it does a pretty good job, which isn't wholly unsurprising, because if you dig into the American Community Survey itself, which is the source data of the American Community Survey educational tabulation, what happens is they tell you that the data is really best set up for percentages, proportional representations, that sort of stuff. What we see here is overall American Indian Alaska Native students in the Common Core data represent about 1% of the overall population, compared to the American Community Survey educational tabulation, which is 8. American Indian Alaska Native homeland areas have higher percentages, as you would expect, 5.3 versus 4.8. Overall, what we're seeing is the Common Core data tends to have a little bit of a higher number and a little bit of a higher percentage for American Indian Alaska Native students at large. But what I really want to get into a little bit more is this idea of the coefficient of variation. And this is something that the census reports is basically their estimate of how well they're doing. So what we have up on top is the margin of error. You divide it by 1.645, which gives you basically that range of uncertainty for the estimate. You divide the estimate into that number, and that gives you some sense of how certain or uncertain the census is with its estimates overall that it's presenting. One of the problems here, and it speaks to this issue of potentially zero estimated students being in a district, is the coefficient of variation is 0, it's undefined when the estimate is 0. The ESRI uses a range to estimate whether or not things are high reliability, medium reliability, low reliability, that sort of stuff. And so we're going to use those when we're making some comparisons here. This is a little bit different than the mean absolute percentage error. In many ways, it's very similar, but what it is it's actually comparing the estimated against an established number. So in this case, the actual or the established number that we're using, or I'm using, is the count from the Common Core of data. Other than that, it's very similar. But the nice thing here is it's not dependent upon whether or not the census has come up with an estimate that's not equal to 0. So this also provides an estimate of accuracy for the American Community Survey educational tabulation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all these school districts, match them up, pull the Common Core estimates into a 5-year period, take that average, and compare that to the value that's provided by the American Community Survey educational tabulation. So what I have at the moment is how well the ACSED ends up saying it expects to be doing with its reliability of estimates for the total district population. So all the students are in here. This is not disaggregated by race or anything of that sort. And what you see is most of the districts end up being dark green. The vast majority are either light green or dark green. There are some areas that do have evidence of low quality, but none of poor quality. The black shaded in areas are areas where there's no data, or I wasn't able to match the Common Core data with the American Community Survey educational tabulation. So one thing to do is compare that to how well they actually did. And this is, again, going to show us that in certain areas they're estimating that they're doing quite well. Other areas they're not doing as well as maybe they had thought. A lot of this accuracy, as you would expect, is going to be, like I said, dependent upon how many individuals are in the survey, their ability to survey certain areas. We know that certain areas with low income and that are often rural in nature tend to have difficulty in the American Community Survey. And that's some of the stuff that you're likely seeing here. We can then disaggregate this just a little bit by race and say, well, let's look at what's going on for white students. Again, this is how well essentially the census believes it is doing at estimating the number of white students. It provides a margin of error and says, well, these estimates are pretty reliable. These are not quite so reliable. For white students, again, you see largely dark green, light green in nature. This is all the districts. There are a number in low and poor quality areas, but things look a little bit different when you look at the American Indian Alaska Native population as itself. And so here, what we have is, again, how well the census believes that it's doing, or I'm sorry, this is the absolute percentage error for, this is initially all students for absolute percentage error. This is coefficient of variation for white students. This is how well it believes it's doing for white students. This is how well it actually is doing for white students. So I apologize for that. You can see, again, some of these areas where you're expecting maybe smaller concentrations of white students, rural areas potentially popping up. And now we're moving to American Indian Alaska Native students. And this is how well the census believes that it's doing for estimating American Indian Alaska Native K-12 students. One thing here is those areas that are in black are areas where either I wasn't able to match, or there are areas where no students are estimated to be living. And so if we look at the absolute percentage error, what we get is a little bit of a different map, and that shows the difference between these two is all of the areas that have now filled in are areas where the estimate was 0, but students actually reside. In general, we can see that the American Community Survey does believe that it's doing quite well in the southwestern areas, and it's doing generally its best there. Oklahoma area, you can see it's doing pretty well there, but it's having some issues in other areas. So we can break this down a little bit more for averages and see how many students are missing in each area. We see that overall, if you total up all of the students that are missing in that one particular area that's filled in, we have about 46,000 students. If you look into different geographic areas, you see that this is something that does pop up in most areas. The one place where you don't have students that are missing are exactly where you would expect them to not be missing or the census to do well, and that is in those majority American Indian Alaska Native districts. But we also see here there's about 13% of all the districts in American Indian Alaska Native homelands that are incorrectly assigning 0 students to them. And looking at those majority American Indian Alaska Native districts itself, like I said, there's 0 false zeros, whereas secondary majority, there's quite a bit. We have about 13% of all the districts in those secondary majority areas have incorrectly assigned a percentage of 0 students, or a total student, 0 American Indian Alaska Native students.
Jeff, we're kind of running out of time. Can you
all right.
wrap up in less than a minute?
Yep. Yeah, I'll do that. So one of the things that we can do is we can look into some of the particular areas where this might be the most egregious itself. But basically, my conclusions here are the majority of school district estimates for American Indian Alaska Native students fall into that low quality, poor quality category. More than half of the districts containing American Indian Alaska Native students falsely assign a 0 to that. And we have more than 3,000 students living in American Indian Alaska Native homeland areas where the American Community Survey educational tabulation says none exist.
Thanks, Jeff. Ray Foxworth will be discussing. Ray, the floor is yours.
Awesome. You want to give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay?
Thumbs up.
Awesome. First of all, thank you, Matt, and thank you to CICD for organizing this conference, and Dr. Burnett for this great paper. Before I try to provide some comments for this wonderful paper, I want to first acknowledge that I'm not a specialist in education geography, or I'm not someone that uses a ton of education or district level data in my own research. And I don't use ACS Edge. So I want to be transparent about that so Dr. Burnett can correct anything that I misstate from my own ignorance about the data tools. So that's my preface to my comments. The paper really continues to build on questions and concerns that have been raised over the last day and a half of this conference on research and data collection, the reliability and accuracy of settler data, and how tribes and Native communities more broadly can and should demand better quality data from the federal government and their agencies who attempt to count this nation's Native population. I want to start with an obvious point, and this kind of builds on a point that Mel brought up in the previous session. In my work at First Nations, we work with Native nations, including tribal departments and programs, and Native-led and controlled nonprofits across the country. And as has been highlighted in different panels throughout the last day and a half, census data, including ACS data, really are the go-to data sets used by tribal grant writers, tribal planners, though there is a growing movement of tribes who are building their own capacity around collecting census data of their tribes. But in this world of data collection and analysis, I really want to stress that we really do need more scholars and researchers, especially Native scholars and researchers, doing this kind of work to scrutinize and question the reliability of what I call settler state data, which includes census data. But beyond that, we need more work like this to equip tribal leaders and other Native leaders across the country with this information so they can develop advocacy plans and strategize potential solutions to improve data quality about Native people in this country. With that, we also need more forums like this to move beyond sort of academic discussions and academic jargon, and really provide spaces and opportunities to ensure this kind of timely and relevant information reaches the hands of leaders in Indian country who need it most to advocate and change policy. So that's one important point I took away from reading this paper. Second, to me, this paper really has two big picture headlines. The first is that we really need to question the accuracy and reliability of ACS data and indicators within ACS across diverse geographies where Native people live. Yesterday, we heard a great deal of discussion on the accuracy of census data, but this really extends that conversation beyond the data collected every 10 years through census and raises important questions of data quality related to ACS. And those indicators need greater scrutiny, especially across different geographies. The second big picture headline is really about the high degree of uncertainty around counts of Native students and their erasure from district level data across geographical context. In this paper, he notes, something around over 6,200 districts with false zeros for American Indian Alaska Native student population. There are over 6,200 districts with false zeros of the Native population, and about 30,000 AI/AN students living in these districts. The vast majority are in districts that are outside of tribal homelands, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian homelands. But even in districts with an AI/AN NH homeland, there are over 2,500 students when ACS Edge notes that there are none. And looking at places where the Native population are a secondary majority, mostly in places near tribal lands, the undercount is at least roughly 1,200. That is in total almost an undercount of 35,000 Native students across different geographies in the US. I appreciate him showing tables 5 and 6, naming some of the districts where false zeros are the highest. And some, as you saw, were on tribal homelands and some not. This identification really provides some leverage to further understand, sorry, I got distracted by the chat, sorry, why ACS undercounts AI/AN students in districts. So it really does provide great leverage to further understand these undercounts. Hopefully, I look forward to hopefully either you or someone else advancing that research to look at, whether these issues are systemic or institutional, are driven by individual level factors. Lastly, I'll just say the study has implications for tribal policymakers and also policymakers at the national level or at state level who use ACD data for policy development, appropriations, and so on. Moreover, this paper really does have implications for researchers who are using ACS data within their models, that we need to provide greater scrutiny of this data. Overall, this paper brings up the important question of how do tribes continue to demand accountability and accuracy of data collected by the federal government. These aren't new questions, right? These are questions that have been going on for centuries about how tribes and how Native people in the US get better counts of their population. But the paper does also raise the question of how off-tribal land Indian organizations also develop their research and advocacy capacity and collaborate with tribal governments to challenge inaccurate data and demand better data quality. I'll end it there. I know we're close to time. And thank you so much for allowing me to read and discuss this paper. And I look forward to seeing it in publication and also as a tool for Native leaders across the country.
Thank you, Ray. We only have a couple minutes for questions. There's one in the chat that I would like to pose, and then we'll turn it over to the lunch break. So one question pertains to multiracial American Indian, Alaska Native students in the census. So the question is, the census believes 61% of Native people are multiracial. That would seem to have a major impact on your data, which is limited to one race, American Indian, Alaska Native students and white students. Is that accurate?
Only in so much as I think we potentially have more students that are not being counted. So the comparison between the two data sets is solely on single race non-Hispanic. So I am comparing apples and apples and oranges to oranges here. So the ACS educational tabulation does include additional disaggregations for American Indian, Alaska Native students. But here I'm just looking at one estimate that they have, and that's just how many total students live there that are single race, non-Hispanic, American Indian.
Okay, great. Well, we've reached the end of this session. I want to thank Jeff and I want to thank Ray for their insightful research and comments. I also look forward to seeing this in a published form, and thank you both. So with that said, it is the lunch break, and I will turn over the floor to Jack Gladstone, who will be in charge of our lunch break story and song with Jack Gladstone. So the floor is yours, Jack.
Good morning and good afternoon to the attendees of the summit here. Again, my name is Jack Gladstone, an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe up here in northwestern Montana, in Helena currently. And I'm going to share with you today, I mentioned the other day, the best least words is oftentimes what this comes down to. And with tribal stories, legends, traditions, what the Greeks called mythos. Mythos references ancient, original, and sacred words. And that is where the principles and the values and a lot of the ideological understandings come from in my own tribe. I would like to play you the set, Spirits, Heroes, Tricksters, and Fools, starting out with the title track of Buffalo Cafe.
Gather round me, young and old, girls and boys of these stories, about the land that taught us to talk. With mother's hand, we'll learn to walk, we'll travel back in time to the last ice age, with the sun's creation fully engaged. Spirits and heroes, tricksters and fools, there's something for everyone. I now anoint this play, the Buffalo Cafe. A symphony of the waving grass was composed by sun and cast, with characters of wing and fur. Beneath the water creatures stirred, our creator's voice was a thunder roll. All of creation shared one soul. Spirits and heroes, tricksters and fools, there's something for everyone. Nature's anointed play, the Buffalo Cafe. Mustangs and eagles weave circles with the sun. They were and still are part of everyone. I'm looking for the wings to fly and the hooves to touch the earth, where we'll be free again. There we can see again the home that was known at our birth. Gather round me, young and old, girls and boys, there'll be stories told about the land that taught us to talk. With mother's hand, we learned to walk. We traveled in time to the last ice age, with the sun's creation fully encaged. Spirits and heroes, tricksters and fools, the cast includes everyone in this unfolding stage of our Buffalo Cafe, nature's anointed play. Everybody sing the Buffalo Cafe. The Buffalo Cafe. Buffalo Cafe. A Buffalo Cafe. There they go. One of the most important the two most important story forms, because you really can't have one without the other, is the hero and the trickster. The hero comes to us in selflessness, in a very high, sincere regard for the welfare of the larger picture, whereas the trickster frequently occurs as somewhat of a self-centered being, with probably overconsumption of we'll call it 8 of the 7 deadly sins there. But the transformation and the transfer and the reconciliation and the atonement from trickster to hero is part of our opportunity here in life. One of my favorite Blackfeet trickster hero stories is called The Bear Who Stole the Chinook. Now, the bear is not actually a bad guy in this. He simply wants to warm up. And in the long ago time, one winter, the warm, dry westerly wind we know as Siksipoo, Blackfeet, it is the black wind, come over the Mistakiks, the backbone of the world. And in the wintertime, this warm wind that originates from the Pacific would drop its moisture on the western slopes of both the Pacific coast and the Cascades, and also on the Rocky Mountains. And then when it reached the Great Plains, the Northwestern Plains, it would bulldoze and it would alleviate the snow and the ice from different areas, make it then possible for the hunting to take place. All the animals would move as the buffalo centered on the grass that had been liberated by the warm, dry west wind. In the long ago time, one winter though, the Chinook wind failed to come, and as the firewood ran low, as the stocks of meat ran low, the pemmican, dried meat ran low, something had to be done. A young orphan boy stepped forward. He said, "I will help you, my people. I will find out what has happened to the Chinook wind, and if I could, I'll bring it back." And the boy set off by himself. He was wrapped up. Nobody expected to ever see him again. But the boy had faith, and the boy also had a connection, for he had not yet lost the ability to communicate with the animals. This is the story of the recovery of one such Chinook wind in the long ago time, the bear who stole the Chinook. Everybody give me a growl out there. Oh, the snow came early and lay on deep. The cold blown bitter made the women weep. Our men tracked hard but could find no cane. In our children's bellies were crying pains. Our elders gathered in the heathen dawn. They prayed and waited and looked, but little did they know that way up high the bear had stole the Chinook. Everybody sing. The bear had stole the Chinook. A ragged orphan boy living alone called to the animals in his home. How the magpie flew on him. The coyote and weasel, there's four of them. As their council met, the magpie caught as their hero shivered and shook. He said, my relatives told me so. He said, the bear has stole the Chinook. Sing it. The bear has stole the Chinook. Our hero's journey to release the wind turned west of the mountain bear's den. For days they teamed and traveled along. Together they did ascend up to the den that held the Chinook. The grizzly snored and snarled in his sleep. Owl crept close into his lodge peep. Everybody. Bear punched Owl's eyes with a stick. So they sent in a brother who was lightning quick. The weasel slithered easy through the hole and found the elkskin bag of the crook. The bear in rage roared, go away. And the bear said, I'm the bear who stole the Chinook. I'm the bear who stole the Chinook. Then our friends make medicine smoke appear and blew it in the grizzly bear's den. The big old grizz fell fast asleep as coyote crept on him. He found the bag where the wind was kept, pulled it to the light of day. There a prairie chicken picked the stitches out. Now the prairie chicken was a consultant. Then the Chinook blew on its way. The Chinook blew on its way. Well, the bear burst suddenly from his sleep. Bear said, ooh. Our friends all fled, their job complete. The bear in vain pursued the wind. Oh, but the warm wind nettles again his friend. Now bear sleeps underground the winter long. In his lodge he grumbles and looks back to the days of the winter warmth. Everybody sing. To the bear who stole the Chinook. One more time. To the bear who stole the Chinook. Okay, now for the bear. I'm the bear who stole the Chinook. One more time. I'm the bear who stole the Chinook. Big growl. Okay. Bear who stole the Chinook. The bear, over the entire northern hemisphere, around the entire northern hemisphere of planet Earth, with the long cold winters, the bear was just about universally renowned as the holder of warmth and the light, and the bearer of that warmth and the light when the spring emerged, of course, when the days got longer. But everything within the mythopoetic tradition, the metaphorically poetic tradition of our people, this was woven into beautiful stories and legends, and again, mythos, ancient original sacred words, to harmonize, to help us harmonize and to help us balance and to help us stay in tune with our environment and with our community. The wolf was, makui is the Blackfeet word for a wolf, makui, and this means big mouth because of the powerful jaws.
recorded at the highest compression 1,400 pounds per square inch. But those same jaws, the wolf could exhibit this bone-crushing power. Those same jaws were gentle enough to carry puppies from one den to another in times of danger. This story here is called Wolves of Ice and Snow. It's an ancient Blackfeet story about the long ago time when one winter old man Napi was the trickster. He was a personification of every deadly sin there was. And Napi was always looking for, some way, some shortcuts around things. And he come across a band of wolves. He saw they were dancing upon a crystalline river of ice down below. And whatever they wished for, whatever they called out, they said, Ponoka, Poksaput. Elk would come. Iniwa, Poksaput. The buffalo would come out of that ice. Of course, the latent or the principle of creation is within water, and ice is that principle in suspended animation. And Napi come down and says, Okay, Makui. And they say, Okay, Napi, Poksaput, Akiaksayup. It's time to eat, they said. Time to eat. Napi was really happy. And after the meal, Napi said, Please, brother wolves, I want you to share with me the song and the dance where I too can acquire anything I desire. And the wolves looked at one another, looked at Napi. They said, Napi, you are a great fool, and you're not known for keeping your promises. But I tell you what, we will teach you our song, but you give us your word that you'll never misuse his power. And essentially what this power is in the breakdown, and I think in a mature interpretation of the story, is the power that the wolves had to cooperate, to coordinate, to communicate together in order to achieve great things. That is the challenge, not just for wolves, but the challenge for our tribes. That is a challenge for humankind, whether it be on a local, a state, a regional, a national, or an international basis today, in order to help our planet survive. This song is one of my favorites, and this is Wolves of Ice and Snow. The day was young, the sky full of sun. Crystal River shivered in the earth's backbone. When old man heard the comforting words of the wolves singing high, dancing low. Songs were sung, dance was spun, steps aligned in rhythm, given path to grow. In humble face, old man was amazed by the wolves singing high, dancing low. There before his eyes he saw a portion of the ice did thaw, and lo, behold, there sprang a buffalo. Upon this occasion, a portion of creation was released in pairs into the world below. Through the message of the wolves of ice and snow, old man asked that both song and dance be swiftly given as a gift from wolf to him. In trust he received, then left to retrieve for himself more pleasure in the wind. Up and down the backbone Napi hunted for adventure, soon to find a sparkling river frozen in the sun. Upon admonition by an elder's admonition, his gift became unraveled, a promise was undone.
Humble happenstance delivered the tense before self-righteous ego triggered trust to decay. Their crystalline river remains clearly to see as the trail some call the Milky Way. As you're looking through the jaws of heaven to the stars above, consider the limits of the known. Whenever despair comes, the cycle of the earth and sun in certain time transitions dusk to glow. Through the blessings of the wolves of ice and snow, we're interwoven with the wolves of ice and snow. The day's still young, the sky's full of sun.
Blackfeet Wolf songs were sung by warriors, were sung by scouts, were sung by hunters before we went out on the path to understand we have to rid ourselves of the divisions that connect us in order to accomplish those big things in the hunt or on the warpath or just accomplishing survival. It is also very common for our Plateau and Plains Indians and a lot of northeastern tribes to have the wolf as the center of the warrior societies, in that the disciplined, even wolves, dogs, crazy dogs, our Blackfeet called it. It was the Marines after the Battle of Bellewood in, I think it was 1918 in Europe, but it was the Marines that actually were bailing things out there, and the Germans were about ready to overrun Paris. And finally the Marines, back and forth they went, finally the Marines had one savage counterattack. And lo and behold, the Germans said, those devil dogs, and they retreated for the last time and wound up having to sign the armistice and the peace treaty. Just a reminder, when we are together and we are moving in coordinated harmony together, we're hard to beat. The song I would like to share with you right now is going to go off the rails a little bit. This is called the Hudson's Bay Blues, and I wrote this song, back in the mid-90s. And the song is about the Hudson's Bay Company. Hudson Bay Company we called them, they were the first white men that we encountered, and not Pequans, men, white men, trickster men. Napiakis, trickster women. And it was the Hudson's Bay Company that helped the Blackfoot Confederacy transform into one of the most powerful confederacies, one of the most powerful nations in North America. And this song is about the other part of that, the coming of the shopping culture to our people in the late 1700s.
Well, I was riding on my pony, hunting bison on the plains, when the moccasin telegraph reported something strange. Someone building lodges made with stone and logs. They had bushes on their faces and funky-looking dogs, loading off big bundles, triple wide canoes full of trading items. Out of sight creation sang the blues. Tomorrow's our grand opening. Grab your robes and furs. We're wheeling, dealing, feasting, drinking till you engines purr. We didn't know shopping, didn't know shopping. We didn't start shopping, we didn't start shopping. Couldn't go shopping to the Hudson's Bay Company. For the horses and dogs of them piled high with skins, it was unfamiliar territory we had wandered in. Bushy-faced Napiquans that said we'll smoke and drink, so we prepared our sacred path and Napiquans just wait. When the smoke's over, they said, we've got a gift for you that'll fill your head with the visions, make you strong and happy too. Didn't quite know what to think before we drank that rum. This firewater devil started a rabbit on the run, got us ready for shopping, ready for shopping, ready for shopping. Yeah, we were ready for shopping, the Hudson's Bay Company. We wanted flintlocks, wool socks, coffee beans, denim jeans, iron awls, musket balls, powder horns, and pretty shawls, blankets, buttons, bolts, flannel, silver belts, tallow candles, sugar flour, dark molasses, colored peas, looking glasses, pale ale, gin, and brandy, wine, hard rock candy. Through service was awful handy. Oh, we couldn't stop shopping. Oh, we wouldn't stop shopping. We couldn't go shopping, the Hudson's Bay Company. Well, last night I was walking up and down the aisles of Costco in Helena, Montana, and I looked up to my right before I left and noticed there were mountains of merchandise, and to my left still more mountains of merchandise. Before long I realized that once again I too had become a victim and a beneficiary of the shopping culture. You know what? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, cowboys and Indians in the 21st century, Kmart, Walmart, Target, Shopko, Sam's Club, even Costco.com are nothing more than fur trading posts on steroids. Now we got spandex, Gore-Tex, Nike hairs, gummy bears, ceiling fans, frying pan, turkey veal, shrimper spam, sail, cycle, sports, rackets, rollerblades, jean jackets, keyboards to surf the net, on a tidal wave of debt, MasterCard, Visa card, Christopher Columbus card. Christopher Columbus was first to say it pays to discover. American Espresso Lord, every kind of car. Can't stop shopping. Oh, we can't stop shopping. We can't stop shopping. The Hudson's Bay Company. Okay. I'm going to quickly finish off this set with a verse and a chorus of When Land Belonged to God. This is a song dedicated to Charlie Russell, who recognized that he was an illustrator representing a people, a time, a culture, a relationship, a tradition that was fast fading. And I will add, before I play this song, Russell committed his life to preserving that image and that tradition that was, in a way, salvific to the American West. And with his, I think there's over 4,600 photographs, and not photographs, but paintings and portraits that illustrated the West. In Helena here, there hangs the original painting, When Land Belonged to God, in the State Art Gallery there. And this is a huge herd of buffalo crossing the Missouri River. I'll close out with a bit of this song that I wrote dedicated to that. On the spring heath of 16, Charlie Russell departed from his St. Louis home, a young man whose big dreams had delivered a call to the heart. So by train and stagecoach he made his way through an endless sea of grass that blew to the shore of the big sky's unbroken side, where land belonged to God, where all the wild kin of man danced in rhythm with the land, where grizzly bear and great wolf were first chiefs, where episodes of old man's travels helped our people first unravel the mystery of sacred time between the earth and sky. I'm going to do the last verse right now, so we're going to go up a minute or two over time. Time respects the careful hand when chosen colors are tried. The vision forever stands. The purest gift is not of gold, but in art that awakens the soul. As we choose our trail up the great divide to an unknown trail on the other side, we might realign with the seas of the big sky's unbroken sod, where land belongs to God. On the big sky's unbroken sod, land belongs to God.
Charlie Russell's adopted Blackfoot name is Awakasi. Awakasi means antelope, because our women gave him some white buckskin to patch up the seat of his pants. No more explanation is necessary. Okay, thank you very much for listening here on the Zoom call. Jack Gladstone signing off from the Blackfoot Confederacy.
So hello, everyone. My name is Elijah Moreno. I'm a senior research assistant and member of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation. And I'm presenting today on a data set I've been working on since I started at CICD in September 2020. So over 2 years now at this point, the Native Entity Enterprise Dataset. And just standard disclaimer, the views expressed by me don't necessarily reflect the Federal Reserve Bank system. So this is sort of the culmination of 2 years of work to create this graph. And so these are all native entity enterprises. And what you see is a density map. So the darker the circles, the more enterprises there are. And another thing I want to emphasize is that this is a lower bound estimate. We are still working on building this data set. And at this point in time, 2 years worth of time, we have so far identified over 8,000 native entity enterprises that exist in all 50 states and over 1,300 cities. It's a very geographically diverse area where these enterprises exist. Another important element framing this project is our research principles and how we think about doing work. So another important thing to note is that our research principles have evolved over time and have gotten input from a variety of stakeholders and Indian country tribal leaders. And ultimately, as a center, we want to help promote Native self-determination and provide data, tools, and research to help tribes promote economic development, self-determination. And these guiding principles are also important to keep in mind for how we treat data. We realize data is a powerful tool, and it's a tool that has to be used with great discretion. And so, the consent of who we're talking about is important. Review prior to publication. And in general, we intend not to do harm, and we want to promote self-determination and help improve policymaking for the benefit of Native people with the data and research we generate. So some context for this and why the center prioritized the Native Entity Enterprise data set. So, the pandemic was sort of a big anchor to this. And a lot of discussions we had with tribal leaders also emphasized the need for data for decision-making. We've also met with a variety of tribal enterprise executives as well. And it's also important to note that tribal businesses drive economic development activity for these communities. So they're especially important. And also we've done work throughout the pandemic, and we've surveyed tribal governments, tribal enterprises, and we know the pandemic had a significant effect on both businesses and governments. And so this need for better data and data on business activity, helped reinforce why we focused on this data set. And another important thing to note is that, so our conversations initially revolved around tribal leaders and tribal governments, and historically the center has been relatively small in staff size, like 2 to 5 staff members. And the center is also, it's only 5 to 6 years old. And so we've had a recent expansion, have more than doubled our staff. And this has allowed us also to expand the scope of our work, not just to focus on the lower 48 and tribes in the lower 48, but also Alaska Native tribes and the Native Hawaiian community. So this data set is also an opportunity for us to be more inclusive of the American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities as well. And that's also reflected in sort of recent language changes in our mission statement and things like that. So specifically, what are Native entities? The 3 Native entities we define are federally recognized tribes, Alaska Native corporations, and Native Hawaiian organizations. And the examples you see on the slide are from companies we've worked with on some ongoing research, which is also why we include them as examples. So these Native entities, in this case, Winnebago Tribe, Koniag, and Nakapuna, they own enterprises. So as you see below, and we're able to connect this data to different data sets that provide us revenue estimates, employee estimates, credit rating, location, and founding year, which allows us to do a variety of research. Another important thing to keep in mind is Native entity enterprises are unique and fulfill a unique role for the communities. So these are all things that are true of all Native entity owned enterprises, federally owned enterprises, Alaska Native corporations, and Native Hawaiian organizations. So they're all owned by those Native entities. They also have distinct legal structures. One can't simply just create a tribal enterprise unless they're a tribe, for example. So these companies exist in a specific context, and they serve a specific purpose in their communities. All these companies have unique connections, direct connections to the communities they serve. And they also provide an important source of revenue, an ability to provide critical community services for their respective communities. In the case of tribal enterprises, it's government's revenue. We spoke to one tribal enterprise who said they're essentially 100% taxed by the tribal government. So, these tribal enterprises exist for the benefit of tribal citizens. So just wanted to add that distinct note as well. Oh, also, another thing to keep in mind with this slide is as we created this data set, we kept these elements in mind. So, if it's owned by the tribe or ANC or NHO, and we keep in mind unique ownership cases where it could be a percentage ownership where possible. So anything owned by these Native entities that's an enterprise, we collect information on it. And they also generate a source of revenue for the community. So they're revenue generating businesses. And this is also where all the data sources, or this is where the Native entity enterprise data set, like the underlying sources of data for it. So the first 3, like AQUA, the Federal Register, National Park Service, Office of Native Hawaiian Relations, those provide sources of Native entities. So to build a data set on Native entity enterprises, you need a list of Native entities. So the official list of federally recognized tribes, Alaska Native corporations, so Alaska Native Village corporations, Alaska Native regional corporations, and also how those corporations connect to associate Alaska Native tribes. And the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations also maintains a list of Native Hawaiian organizations for consultation purposes. So those are the sources of Native entities. The next sources are major sources for how we identify enterprises. And so the SBA Dynamic Small Business Search database is one source of data. And we've released an article using this data last year but it has, you have the ability to look at these different type of native entity-owned enterprises and extract data about them. Another major source we have is the web sample, where we go native entity by native entity and look at various online sources like their own tribal website, annual reports, websites the company owns that lists, subsidiaries, to provide these lists of companies owned by native entities. So the important thing to emphasize here is that the linkages between native entities to companies is all human-made, which is a very intensive process, but you can look at every single company and there's a source for why it's associated with a specific native entity. So it takes a lot of work. We also review it. So that's one aspect of it. With those lists of native entity enterprises, you can also add unique identifiers like DUNS numbers or cage code that you can look up online. And that allows you to connect to this last tier of databases, which provide establishment level data. So Bloomberg Government and HireGov are both databases that collate federal contracting data. Casino City is a database that has casino gaming data. And NETS is a database that the Federal Reserve has access to that has revenue, employee estimates, credit rating, and a variety of other statistics. And so we stitch all these data together to create the native entity enterprise data set. And we also have the ability to look more in depth into certain industries. So federal contracting and gaming, we can look more in depth into those industries because we're also making addition to those data sets as well. So we don't just take Casino City and use it. We make adjustments to it. Like, for example, we're adding opening and closing dates of casinos. We're also categorizing the opening and closing dates, like what type of opening it was, like a grand opening or expansion opening or renovation opening. All those are important and have research consequences, which is why we're keeping track of them. So yeah, and also on the right, you'll kind of see the sources of the data. So a lot of them are publicly available, like anyone can just get the data. But the real labor intensive part is like creating the linkages between native entities and enterprises. And then getting data on enterprises themselves in terms of like revenue. Those data sets are usually you have to pay for. So this combination of things has created this data set. Okay, so and sort of as I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this presentation, a lot motivated the creation of this data set. And as a center, like I said, we want to promote tribal economic self-determination, and we want to be inclusive of the Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian communities as well. The work we do is guided by our research principles and can lead to a variety of products like web articles, research papers, and data tools, ultimately with the hope that tribes can use them, that policymakers can use them to evaluate policy effectively and make sure things are as good as they can be for Indian country. So yeah, that is all that I have for you today. So I just had some questions for the audience, and I'll try to find the questions in the chat if there's any. Sorry, just figuring out my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah. Okay, does not look like there are any questions in the chat. Yeah, so I guess another element of this is that we are still working internally on a lot of different things we have processes in place right now to safely store and protect the data. And we are developing processes to share different elements of it, and how we should share it is something we want sort of feedback on, because we also realize that this data is sensitive, and perhaps certain elements of it shouldn't be shared publicly. So that's also something we would welcome feedback on. So I guess another thing to be clear is, so at this point we have over 8,000 enterprises owned across Alaska Native companies, tribal enterprises, and Native Hawaiian organizations. But we are not done compiling data. So I think, so this is a lower bound estimate, and I think it's only going to increase over time, is like one important thing to keep in mind. And yeah, so the data set NETS, the National Establishment Time Series data set, they have establishment year, like when it was started. And they also have when establishments no longer exist. So you'll be able to understand, like the length of the business as well. Oh, sorry, had some questions in the chat. So the first question was, how many enterprises are we talking about? So I answered that. And then the other question was, do you have information on years for business entry and exit? So, and we also have that as well. And in terms of where we can see more, so we do have an article upcoming on federal contracting and Native entity involvement in federal contracting. So that'll be sort of like a utilization of this data set, the need in that industry. We also plan to do a variety of research on different topics, like around gaming and federal contracting involvement. And we hope to use this data to build tools that tribal leaders, Alaska Native corporations, and Native Hawaiian organizations would find valuable as well. So another question is, what are a few of the most impactful questions that you see the need being able to help explore? So I think one that I think will be important is, I think casino gaming has been a topic that's been studied a lot. It's important for tribes for a variety of reasons, but one thing that hasn't been looked at is its impact on access to capital. And so NETS allows us to look at credit rating changes of businesses. And so one thing we hope to do in the future is to look at how gaming has influenced or has shaped credit ratings, which would help improve tribal access to credit. So, obviously casinos generate a lot of revenue, they create a lot of jobs, but I think they also improve access to capital. So that's like one question we're interested in exploring. We're also interested in doing work around federal contracting, and obviously the 8A program is very important for all Native entities. And we want to understand the 8A's impact on those associated Native communities. It's also, we also want to understand barriers to entry to the 8A program. We've spoken to a variety of Native entity-owned firms, so Native Hawaiian organizations, Alaska Native corporations, and tribal organizations or tribal enterprises, and it's difficult for some of them to get into the 8A program. And while in, there's a lot of things that you have to keep in mind. So we hope to kind of shed light on the program and kind of inform policy. Yeah, and also this also connects to Alicia Murphy's remarks earlier, the Navajo Nation economist, and themes around partnership that have emerged over the course of the summit. And I think that this data is even more valuable in partnership with tribes, Alaska Native corporations, Native Hawaiian organizations. For example, working with individual enterprises to validate the data we have compared to what they have, to see how reliable the data is, and what questions it can answer. That's just one example. Is the data is only better with partnerships. I think also, like I said, I've talked to a variety of different Native entity enterprises, especially for our work in federal contracting, and these conversations are like immensely valuable. You learn a lot of information, and I think that just building these relationships help inform topics we might not even be aware about. So that's another question is, with this new data available, what kind of new explorations for analysis could it provide that we might not even have thought of? Yeah, and so another question is, can you expand on some examples of the community services that Native entities provide with the revenues? So all Native entities provide, some variety of community services, benefits. Scholarships is something that a lot of these firms provide to the community. Alaska Native corporations and tribal enterprises also have Indian hiring preferences, and so they can provide additional employment opportunities for Native people. In the case of tribal enterprises, a lot of their revenue can be used to fund important government services, like tribal healthcare, police forces, infrastructure, construction. That's also a topic we want to understand more, is how Native entities use their revenue in different ways to support their communities. Because I think that's another important thing to understand is, these aren't just businesses that generate revenue and make a couple individuals wealthy. The revenue serves an important purpose for these Native communities and impacts many people. So that's another important thing to keep in mind with Native entity enterprises. And also the nice thing about NETS is that it's a database that contains businesses across the country over time. And so we're able to compare Native entity enterprises to non-Native entity enterprises. In like our federal contracting data, for example, we can compare Native entity enterprises to other minority-owned firms, or just other non-minority-owned firms as well. So certain data sets give us an ability to look at different things, but in general, we do have the ability to compare Native entities to each other, to themselves, and also to other minority-owned firms and non-minority-owned firms as well. And I would say we've been focused a lot on building the data set, which has taken a tremendous time and effort. And we've just started to, in some instances, use it for analysis, like with federal contracting. But because the data set isn't finished yet, we can't say anything broadly about, like, here's a total number of businesses in Indian country that are owned by tribes. But we do think that the Native entity enterprise data set will be the closest thing to like the universe of Native entity owned businesses that exist, because we also keep track of businesses that no longer exist as well. Yeah, so I think that's, oh, okay. So the last question. So what can researchers and others outside Indian country learn from Native entity owned enterprises? So one thing I'm interested in personally is looking at this Indian hiring preferences that Alaska Native corporations and tribal enterprises have. So they can legally have a preference for tribal citizens when they hire for positions or promotions, and that's going to likely have consequences for employment and income. And I think it has broader consequences because it could, if we show that Native entity enterprises increase employment more so for Native people, then it has a lot of consequences that could apply to different areas. I'm also interested in looking at the impact, or researchers can look at the impact of Native entity enterprises on infrastructure. Like, for example, casino gaming, a lot has to happen around it, like road improvements, sewage, power, and those all have consequences for infrastructure. So I think that enterprises, it's not just about employment and wages, but they can be used for other things that are important to understand about economic development. I also think that Native entities, in particular tribes, often have to get into intergovernmental agreements like tax compacts, gaming compacts that have consequences for their enterprises, and so kind of shows how to navigate these sort of like complex political relationships now to reduce friction for economic development. So yeah, I think that probably answers that question. So yeah, so okay, there's one more question. So yeah, it's a good question. After this impressive initial phase, what opportunities for expansion of the need do you see? So some things I just mentioned were like intergovernmental agreements or litigation potentially. So I think oftentimes if tribes want to do something, usually it's difficult. Say if they want to build a casino or expand a casino, that can result in litigation. And litigation is costly. It costs a lot of money, and also it delays projects. And so that could be better used for economic development purposes. So I think, I think a lot of legal data can be added to the data set. Like, do these intergovernmental agreements like or tribal gaming compacts impact certain companies, or does litigation impact certain companies? So I think that would be important to understand. I think we can also link census data, community data to the Native entities themselves and see how that changes over time with business development. So we have another presentation or panel next. So I'm going to give the floor to Roberta Downing.
Good afternoon. I'm Roberta Downing. I'm Assistant Vice President for Policy with the Center for Indian Country Development and the Community Development Department here at the Minneapolis Fed. I'm very honored to be moderating our policymaker panel today for the CICD Research Summit. The focus of our conversation will be on informing federal policy and funding through tribally certified data and opportunities to fill gaps. We have a really wonderful panel of federal leaders with us here today that I'd like to introduce. We have Fatima Abbas, who is the Acting Director of the Office of Tribal and Native Affairs at the U.S. Treasury Department. We also have Heidi Frechette, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Native American Programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have Jason Friagi, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Management in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Welcome panelists. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for participating. And oh, sorry, and I need to introduce one more panelist. Sorry about that. We also are very honored to have Heather Dawn Thompson with us today, who's the Director of the Office of Tribal Relations at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Welcome, everybody. So before we begin, I wanted to mention that the views expressed in this conversation are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System or the Center for Indian Country Development. But with that, I want to launch into some of our questions for our panelists. The first one is, how do you use data when it comes to policymaking related to Indian country at your agency? And maybe I'll ask Fatima to start us off, but really want to encourage the panelists to jump in and have a conversation with each other in this panel as well. So I'll turn it over to Fatima.
Thank you so much, Roberta, and thank you to Federal Reserve and CICD for this summit and this invite. So first, Treasury, like a lot of agencies, uses tribal data to allocate funding, especially for ARPA and many of the recovery acts that was passed. And our biggest allocation involved assistance from Casey Lozar as a detailee. So I thank him for his service at Treasury on our $20 billion fund, where Treasury, for the first time, based off of tribal consultation, used tribal self-certified enrollment data that the BIA collected. Huge shout out to Jason and the BIA team for that interagency collaboration. But we used that to obtain data that 579 tribes had over 2.6 million tribal citizens, and we allocated part of our funding off of that. And Treasury just released a report during the White House Tribal Nations Summit regarding the 3,000 projects tribal nations have engaged in just 1 year, based off of that data that was collected. So that is one of the biggest success stories on tribal self-certified data to date.
Exciting, thank you.
I'm happy to jump in and just kind of build on what Fatima described. Really, a lot of the data is focused on awarding, allocating funding to tribes and tribally designated housing entities for HUD. And we really take a approach of deferring to the tribes on the type of data that we use. We negotiate with them to determine the data we use for example, our Indian Housing Block Grant, which is our largest source of funding, and it's determined through negotiated rulemaking. So the formulas we create to allocate funding is really tribally driven consensus process. And we also look at, the current housing stock as well as the need in the communities. We also use decennial census and ACS data to look at, other factors such as lack of indoor plumbing, overcrowding, income levels of families living in the service areas, and things like that. So it's a big piece of that. We've coordinated with Treasury and Interior on data as well, and really looking at, what the future holds as far as data, and looking at some of the other sources that agencies are using now.
Just jump in on the interior side, like HUD and Treasury, obviously allocating funding is one of the key aspects. We also used the enrollment data we collected, provided to Treasury for their 20 billion. We also used for allocating for our funding, which wasn't quite as much, but it was still a lot of money. And similarly, just the good news note, we did consultation with tribes about collecting enrollment data on an annual basis, and they overwhelmingly supported it. And we just got this week OMB approval for under the Paperwork Reduction Act to start collecting enrollment data on an annual basis. So the good news is we'll have updated data every year that we can go to tribes should, for whatever opportunity, whether it's the big ones, like the stimulus types of payments, or if we're talking about annual program activities. The other area, just to call out real quick, that data is key for us is in a lot of our other business lines. So for example, our realty world, BIA plays a really huge role in terms of issuing permits, leases, other realty related actions that are critical for investments at other agencies like HUD, and USDA and others, whether it's related to loans or some of these other realty actions that are necessary, rights of way for moving infrastructure. So that's what our data starts to get really complex in terms of both kind of the administrative data we need to collect from the individuals requesting those actions, but also the underlying geospatial data. Because all these place-based things, you need really strong geospatial information. So that's another important areas that we're looking to improve our capabilities. But obviously data, whether it's student scores, whether it's crime rates, student scores for BIE schools, crime rates, or other statistical law enforcement data for our Office of Justice Services, we really are awash in that. And so we recently just brought on a new chief data officer for Indian Affairs to help us have a strategy to better manage this data, to make it easier to access, integrate, and apply. Obviously, upfront recognizing the importance of tribal data sovereignty and making sure the tribes understand what we're collecting, what we plan to do with it, who we're sharing it with.
Great. Excellent. So do you encounter data gaps often in your work, and what happens, when in those situations?
I don't know if I would characterize it as data gaps, but it could be. We do have a process in HUD for Indian Housing Block Grant. As I said, we use a different combination of data that was, agreed upon by tribes. But if a single tribe feels like the data that we use to award the Indian Housing Block Grant is not accurate, we have a process where they can challenge the data that we use and provide alternative information and data to base the funding on if they're successful in their census challenge. And this has become, I think, very key when we started working with other agencies awarding the COVID funding, right? And our data was used in other formulas as well. So there's always that option if tribes feel there is a gap or the data is lacking or it's inaccurate for HUD.
Yeah, I can kind of talk to that at USDA, Roberta, because we're a little different at USDA. We don't actually have that many Indian country specific programs. And so we have tribes that are sort of participating generally in our economic development programs, which can prove quite challenging, right? If you're really trying to get dollars to socially vulnerable communities and to Indian country, we don't have sort of Indian preference hiring. We don't have Buy Indian. We don't have targeted Indian programs. And so how do you measure that to really have a good impact in Indian country? And, Treasury sort of really raised this bar on measuring economic impact in Indian country. But before that, and even now, there's not a lot of good data on measuring that. And I'll give you one example. We sort of cobbled together some of the normal economic measurements that we would use to measure socially vulnerable communities, right? To try and create sort of this index in Indian country. And I looked at the list and I was like, whoa, that didn't end up looking like I thought it was gonna look. And we had, for example, a whole lot of really wealthy gaming tribes on the top of that list. And I was like, what variables did we use to measure this? And, graduation rates was one of them, right? And we don't have the highest graduation rates for obvious reasons, in some of our gaming tribes. And so that skewed this socially vulnerable index. So that just goes to show you, especially in some of these programs that are trying to look at economic indicators in Indian country that are not Indian country specific programs, it can be challenging. So that's one of the things that we're thinking about at USDA. How do we measure economic impact, right? And then 2, economic vulnerability when we don't have Indian country specific economic programs.
Interesting.
And just following up on what Heather commented on, I think that's a great framing is Indian country vulnerability, because a lot of the traditional economic indicators, there's not data collected on Indian country, not at the tribal government level and not at the tribal citizen level. So income, housing, education levels, there's aggregate stuff pulled from Census, but there's a range of issues, and Treasury remains in litigation on the CARES Act over our use of Census data. So we've learned a lot from the use of Census, but all of this impacts both allocating funds. So if Treasury had wanted to use some data other than enrollment or employment, it just did not exist. And it also doesn't exist for on versus off reservation. So we have tribal employment data that was self-certified. It's reported in our new report at 500,000 individuals are employed by 579 tribes, but we don't know how many are employed on reservation and off reservation. So when you're trying to target economic development programs, it's pretty much impossible to do so based off of the dearth of economic data.
Interesting. So how do data omissions or incomplete data affect your ability to shape programs and policies at your agencies?
I know in housing, it's really important because what we like to do is show the impacts and the need in Indian country, we had a housing needs study completed in 2017 that, and at that point in time showing the great need. But what we do really need data on, and that I think impacts our ability to really describe the need, is what the impacts of, historically level funding of our largest program and what that means and the impacts in the community to the number of families housed, to the impact on overcrowding in homes, to the cost of rehabilitating homes that are overcrowded. Those are the statistics that we really need to be able to justify and show the growing need and the need for increased funding for our programs. So that's something that, tribes, we've been talking to tribes about, and we have tribes who track that, give it to us voluntarily, which is great, but just being able to help replicate that among other tribes so that tribes can really show us what the gap is of the unmet need and the impacts on the families and the communities.
Thank you.
I'd say at Interior, it's fairly similar. It's really, we have an effort underway to better document that unmet need. But in a lot of cases, we are using that kind of national level view, looking at kind of parity payments or like ideal levels of funding, really, just to provide that context. And often the challenge is getting it uniformly across all the tribes is an ongoing challenge. So we're just kind of starting where we are with the data that we have so we can start to paint the best picture, but really filling in those details will be critical going forward.
Yeah, I agree. And, I can't remember if it was Fatima or Heidi mentioned that the county level data not going down far enough is a huge impediment from a policy making perspective. The fact that the data is not kept at the tribal level and that there aren't, as Jason was saying, sufficient GIS layers and map layers for all the federal agencies to keep the data at the tribal level is a huge problem, at least for us at USDA. So that you're having to only look at census level data for at county level data for all of these different variables, which is not a direct overlay for a lot of tribes, particularly those that are not large land-based tribes. So it's very difficult to measure a lot of things, including, for example, the GAO just asked all of us to measure our economic impact in Indian country. And a lot of this is only kept at the county level. So, we're kind of like, I don't know, who knows if this is really going directly and helping a tribal community. And so pushing really aggressively on the GIS layers, the mapping layers, and the coding layers across federal agencies and at the data level to make sure that everything's being coded at not just tribal or not just county boundaries, but at tribal boundaries would go a very long way.
So can were you going to jump in, Fatima?
Oh yeah, I wanted to give a specific example of this issue because Treasury opened up its last fund called the Local Assistance and County Consistency Fund from ARPA. It was $500 million. And in ARPA, Congress tasked Treasury to consider the economic conditions of each eligible tribe to allocate this funding, which was impossible because there's no data set for the economic conditions of each eligible tribe. We could have asked tribe to do an unfunded census of their citizens, which would have been a huge expenditure of resources. So given that data gap, what we did is we used our existing data on enrollment and employment. And in order to target for negative economic conditions, we reversed our employment. So tribes that had large enrollment, low employment received more funding, and then we put a minimum and a max to ensure that all tribes received some. But basically, it's an imperfect way of targeting tribal funding when you don't have the actual data per each tribe. So just wanted to give a concrete example.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm wondering how easy or difficult is it for you all to work together across federal agencies? If one agency has more data than another, are there opportunities to do that?
Yeah, I think we definitely have some good examples of partnerships. Again, the effort to use enrollment data for American Rescue Plan, that was done in really short order. to be honest, both to consult with the tribes, to do it, to get decent information, and then to make allocations within the timeframes. So I think we do one-on-one. I think one key area of growth is kind of coming up with ways to share data with like memorandums of understanding that document how to, especially if the data is sensitive, that it can't be public, but we have to use it for decisions. And we have initiated a kind of an Indian country data working group. It's about 9 federal agencies that we're addressing a set of common priorities. We are hoping to take that to consultation in kind of January, February timeframe. Some initial set of kind of goals a number of us have been identified.
Yeah, it's a good example, Jason. Another good example is the BIA has been really great with us at USDA and our rural development team in our broadband efforts. We've been really trying to, we've started with broadband, but in all of our economic development efforts, we've been really trying to be much more respectful of tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction over tribal lands, and requiring tribal consent when we have applicants that say they're going to service tribal lands. But in order to do that, they have to know where tribal lands are, right? You can't just go to Google Maps and sort of figure out, where the tribal lands are. And we had incomplete databases, to say the least. And so the BIA has been really super about sharing their tribal lands map layers, including ones that are not publicly available, with our broadband team, to be able to help map those, to help the applicants navigate when they have to go and get tribal resolutions of consent and support to apply for our broadband fund. So we really appreciate that cooperation, and that's gone a long ways for empowering tribal nations on our infrastructure projects.
I would say from HUD's perspective, we've seen a wonderful increase in the amount of coordination among agencies with data, especially, for us around the CARES Act or the ERAP funding, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, really working together. I think Jason's efforts at Interior have been wonderful. We've been participating in that as well. And, Department of Transportation utilizes our similar census data that we used in the Indian Housing Block Grant formula to allocate their funding as well. So there's some historical data sharing, but I think also just in recent years with the need to get COVID relief out quickly, that's really brought a lot of the agencies together to mobilize and get the resources out to tribes.
I'll add from Treasury's end, we have really appreciated BIA and HUD sharing data for our respective formulas. We have not been so cooperative on sharing data with other departments because we have a lot of sensitive tribal financial data. We have the number of tribal expenditures from 2019, the amount of lost revenue during the pandemic, and a lot of tax information, both of tribal citizens and tribal government. So one of the challenges for Treasury is to find the balance between extracting that data to share it both with agencies and stakeholders for research, which is what we did in our recent report, but also safeguarding that tribal data. So I think this interagency effort that Jason mentioned will really be key to setting those standards so that we can protect tribal financial data. But Treasury has to date largely erred on withholding that data for the protection of tribes, but we are looking forward to opportunities to collaborate.
And one thing I note, I think one of the key lessons learned we've had is, especially for agencies that don't have as much programs focused on Native Americans, is educating folks about how the data can be used, like understanding what enrollment data is, the limitations of it, the understanding what the entities are on the Federal Register list of, who's a federally recognized tribe. And it gets even more complex on the geospatial land data, like what are the different boundaries mean? And so I think a key component of this is we're thinking about how we work with other agencies and share data, is there really has to be a lot of education. It's not like you can kind of just drop off the census chart of population and say, create your formula. So a good amount of education has to go with understanding the context, the sensitivity and this kind of historical context of the data also.
Excellent. So what do you think are some of the most important questions related to tribal economic development that could be answered if we had the right data to answer them?
I think Heather Don hit it earlier. I think one of the most key is that what is the overall impact of tribal economies, whether looking at it at a rural, national, regional scale. I think that's one of the holy grail elements we're all kind of aiming for. So I'll let her add to that because I think she had a good vision there.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Jason, that the impact in all those different regions and aspects is huge, right? Because that's how we advocate for our tribal nations and make sure that they have more resources where they need more resources and effectively. And that is really missing. And when they are done, they're hugely impactful. Like I think Rosebud did one for their impact in South Dakota. I think the California gaming tribes did one there. I think the Oklahoma gaming tribes did one, right? They're very specific where they have been done, but where they have been done, those studies get utilized over and over again. And you know, the number of dollars on the res and off the res and the impact there are hugely important and impactful. I would say another sort of data area that we need help on, and I know Jason's team and I have been thinking about this, and there's no easy answer, but it is sort of the definition of tribal lands and tribal boundaries. And there's disagreements amongst tribes and the federal government on how to do that. But as we try to do a better job as the federal government in honoring tribal jurisdiction, we have to be able to define where that tribal jurisdiction is and have some sort of agreement on that. So that's kind of a challenge in trying to figure out how to map that and get good data on that. And then the layers of tribal jurisdiction, the data on that, right? Because there's IHS's jurisdiction, right? Providing services, providing healthcare services. And then there are tribes that effectuate criminal jurisdiction on the other end of the spectrum. And where that line is different, and having different layers of maps to be able to pull in under different circumstances and the different layers is incredibly important once you start to get into really honoring tribal jurisdiction in all these different programs. And so those are the two I would flag: the one that Jason was talking about, an economic impact, and then the tribal layers and mapping and data on that end.
Great. Go ahead, Fatima.
Oh, I just wanted to echo, I think that especially the tribal lands piece is critical, because a lot of federal programs that are not the recovery programs are trying to incentivize development or access to capital, like the Community Reinvestment Act, on tribal lands or native CDFIs. And there's a lot of tension that we hear within the agencies on whether it should be limited to the criminal jurisdiction definition of Indian country, whether Angska land should be included, or near reservation lands, because a lot of businesses are right off the reservation. And if that's not included, it impacts border communities there. So I think that's a clear definition is important for economic development purposes.
Great, thank you. Can you talk to us about your agency's experience using tribally certified data and what that process has looked like?
For us, for the tribal enrollment data, which we collected 2021 and we'll start doing again, overall worked really well. We came up with a fairly simple form to have the tribal leader certify it. And the tribes were, when we did consultation on the tribes about continuing to collect the information, again, overall, they found the process worked pretty well. We had a fairly simple form that they had to fill out. They could sign either electronically or pen to paper, kind of wet signature, and submit it back to us. We are looking at some ways to make it more efficient. But overall, the tribes found that to be pretty effective from their end in collecting it. And then we aggregated it internally. I think the one thing that we're often reminded of, and this came up in consultation also, is just there are some tribes that, you know, even notices going out by paper are sometimes necessary too. And so, and occasionally there's some extra follow-up depending on how remote they are. So just always having those secondary means that don't rely on folks have as up-to-date IT capabilities is key in terms of getting a timely response.
I would just jump in and say in the areas that we do use tribal data, and I mentioned it earlier about challenging the census data, have been very successful. We also use it in really specific instances within the Indian Housing Block Grant when we have overlapping jurisdictions of a tribe and have to allocate, you know, the numbers to either tribe. So, and that's all been agreed to in negotiated rulemaking. I think what's really fascinating and what we're really open to in the future at HUD is looking at how these other agencies are using more of the tribal enrollment data and tribally certified data, and see if that's something that tribes will be considering in future negotiated rulemakings that we have with them around our funding formulas and our Indian housing programs.
And I think one of the good examples that we have of this at USDA is in the broadband context. You have to certify that the area is not served. You know, it's not already receiving a certain level of broadband service. And in the past, we only accepted that data from the pre-existing broadband companies. And this last round of applications, we allowed tribal governments to self-certify whether or not they were receiving broadband service at the levels that was required. And this was really a game changer for a lot of tribal nations.
I would say on the Treasury end, what we found is where tribes are already collecting the data, like enrollment and employment data, we're able to obtain that data fairly quickly. But where tribes are self-certifying for data that's newly being collected, it is an extraordinarily challenging task. So for example, on our emergency rental assistance program, that's a $700 million program to tribes and TDHEs, we permitted tribes to allow citizens to self-certify their need in order to apply for this. The challenge that tribes reported was that a lot of their recipients were off reservation, and so they didn't even have the contacts for potential eligible recipients. So they a lot of times had to eat into their tribal general budget in order to supplement the admin costs, because Congress capped the admin costs for ERA 1. So we flagged that to committees of jurisdiction that when tribes are having to collect data, they typically don't have capping them on admin costs is prohibitive for the success of these programs. So ERA 1, we have over 270 million that tribes have not obligated because of the challenges of administering this program. So just wanted to give a upside and a downside for self-certified data on the capacity level.
That's really helpful, Fatima. I'm wondering, are there technical assistance resources for tribes that are undertaking that kind of a data collection, or are there folks they can turn to for help?
We worked with HUD, so Treasury and HUD provided technical assistance, and that was extremely helpful. The challenge though for tribes was that most of their housing programs are run on reservation, and ERA 1 was largely off reservation because it was landlords off res that were trying to evict tribal citizens, not those on reservation, because that's mostly tribes that are the landlords on reservation. So I think that the key thing is deadlines that are very short and capping their admin costs makes it nearly impossible for them to be successful when they have to collect data, because some tribes are running like 30 programs off the back of one person. So I think the admin capacity is key for this discussion.
Excellent. I know you all have had a busy week with the White House Tribal Nations Summit. I wondered if there were any conversations during the summit that have added new ideas or insights into these issues around Indian country data, or anything else you'd want to share with us from the summit.
I know with the Access to Capital initiative, there's data is really a key part of that, as everyone's talked about today. So I think, first and foremost, that's going to be one of the key ones. Also, when it comes to the kind of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, I know both from our folks and even Secretary Garland or AG Garland, identifying the rollout of the TAPS kiosks to essentially these kiosks that allow local, tribal, BIA, other law enforcement to access information on individuals so they can track down issues faster. So whether it was financial, related to law enforcement, it popped up in many of these areas to drive decisions. Community relocation, we rolled out a big initiative, about $135 million initiative to start relocating some 11 communities. The work to begin that, obviously, data is going to be key, whether it's related to climate change, sea level rise, whether it's planning, land information, like we've talked about. When you get in, moving anywhere, realize land issues, which is always one of the toughest. So really, definitely is popping up in all corners and just increasingly critical.
I would just add to Jason's point, the Access to Capital initiative is huge because there's a focus on tribal governments, tribal citizens, and the native businesses. And oftentimes in economic development, they're kind of all conflated, but these are different communities that have differential needs. Data is a huge piece of all of that. The other item that I think will be very beneficial to departments is the Presidential Memorandum on Consultation and the uniform standards. Each department kind of does consultation slightly different. And I think that reporting out to tribes on the agency actions that are taken will be helpful as we try to become more uniform in our work.
Yeah, and I'd like to point a slightly different area, which is in the Indigenous languages and foods in this space. For the folks that are listening on the phone and on Zoom, you've got the economic and measurement and data expertise to help some of our more grassroots communities. And this administration made a huge commitment to Native languages, to Indigenous foods, to Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge over this last week with the president. And there's going to be a lot of attention put into this space, and that's going to be hard to measure, right? The outcomes for that. And our teammates are going to really need some help in that grassroots space to make sure that those programs continue to be supported. And so I just want to put a shout out for those that do have data measurement experience to really be helpful to our teammates in the more Indigenous space and language space and food space to really help create and design good measurements in that space as the attention starts to go in that direction.
And I would just build upon the access to capital prioritization. HUD, we rolled out a proposed rule on our Indian Loan Guarantee Program this week. We rolled out our Tribal Intergovernmental Advisory Committee announcement. It's the first ever advisory committee at the agency. And really, I see that as the connection, right? The nexus that the senior leadership at HUD will be speaking with tribal leaders to figure out ways to increase, the data and the insight available into barriers and access to capital and other policy matters across HUD, not just with the Office of Native American Programs, but other programs that touch Indian country as well. So a lot of good things coming out of it, and hopefully setting up a structure to get even more insight from tribes on what's going on and what's needed.
Great. So earlier this year, the administration, through an executive order, formed an equitable data working group to study existing federal data collection policies and identify inadequacies and provide recommendations for increasing what data is available for representing the diversity of the American people. How do you think this executive order will impact tribal communities or decision-making at your agencies?
Well, I think an important piece of this is that the working group is from HUD's perspective, a HUD-wide initiative, right? And participation is HUD-wide initiative. And so it gets back to what I was saying earlier in the Native American programs, right? We have insight, the tribes and tribal communities are always, of course, our number one focus. But I think with the equitable data work group, it kind of broadens that audience to bring more people in, and especially at HUD to look at these programs, how they impact, what the impacts are in Indian country, and really just raising the consciousness of that. I think that, we and the data sharing across the federal government. And I think that, like I had mentioned before, the interior work group that Jason has been leading, coordinating with different agencies, I think is really helpful in informing the HUD effort with the larger group.
Adding to that, I think that federal action has helped agencies to also be more supportive of tribal self-certified data. I think there has traditionally been a lot of hesitation to utilize self-certified data for consistency and the ability to verify. But the fact that it's now widely acknowledged there's a dearth of data and it does not exist and there's inequities enables us to propose solutions at the department level to actually obtain the data. So I think at least for Treasury's end, it was very helpful.
Great. So we have a question from the audience that I'm going to read. It says, you talked about economic indicators for each tribe being almost non-existent, and we need to be careful with different layers of tribal maps and jurisdictions. With tribal sovereignty, how can federal governments collect and measure data on economic development indicators?
Jump in. Oh, sorry, Jason.
No, go ahead. I'll go.
I think transparency as to why the data is being collected is huge, and the universe of possible uses, because data that's being collected often needs to be used for different purposes, but there can be potentially negative purposes. So here's an example of an issue. There's no data about the income level for tribal citizens within a tribe, and income is, on the tax side, a highly disputed area, because what is income? Is trust, income something that should be subject to taxation? No. Is income earned on tribal lands? Is per capita payments for gaming income? A tribal member may say no, but they are paying income tax on that. And so if we collect on the policy side data to inform an economic development program, and that was transferred for tax purposes, that's likely not what was consented to. So I think that being transparent in why you're collecting that data and creating safeguards is important for departments to build trust. So those are the kind of conversations that we're having internally on if we collect data for what purposes.
And that's what we really, when we recently did our consultation about collecting enrollment data, some of the tribes went beyond to make comments on this broader sets of economic and other social factors, which many were supportive of that if they think it helps with more equitable payments. They really liked having good enrollment data as a starting point that they trusted, but they also said, that doesn't really tell you who really needs it, right? As we've kind of talked about. So, but as Fatima said, I think that tribal sovereignty is, you know, is on the tribal data sovereignty is that starting point of making sure they're comfortable with the data is being collected, what it's used for, and who we're sharing it with. Those were kind of three clear messages we got when we did that. But and I think sometimes we may have to start, it'd be nice to have the holistic solution, but in some cases we may need to start small. So I know one thing that a lot of folks, some tribes and at the federal level have been interested in better information on tribal government expenditures that we could use for payments. As Fatima said, some of that's very sensitive, so it's not easy to distribute. But for example, when we did the consultation, one of the tribes thought it would be interesting to have tribes start to participate in Census's census of government. But there might be a number of tribes that initially aren't willing to. So that might be an area we'd look for a volunteer tribe to start doing that, because it could start to collect some of this information we could use for economic indicators. So, and maybe we need to start small, build some trust, and then move on. And we're build up, you know, not move on.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier about us not formally requesting data, but just kind of sharing some of the challenges that we experience and, you know, really communicating the unmet need in Indian country and housing and infrastructure and what it would be great to have, right? More insight in. And we found that in sharing that concern, right, and that challenge, that's also the tribe's challenges as well. Tribes have voluntarily given us data that we've been able to use. So I think having that foundation and just keep building on that will go a long way, because it's mutually beneficial, right? We all want the same outcome in the end.
So I wanted to ask if you could look in a crystal ball and look at 5 years from now, what would you want to see in terms of where we'd be at with some of these issues around Indian country data? What do you think can be accomplished, say, within 5 years?
I know at least we're on the path now to, since we got the Paperwork Reduction Act approval, to collect enrollment data regularly, do that accurately. I hope we'd all have better protocols, definitely, for sharing and using Indian country data appropriately, obviously with the tribe's consent. I think down the road, I'd like to see a little, like we talked about earlier, some better the geospatial basis of information we can use. And I hope that the federal family in general is just more fluent on the nature. We won't have perfect information, right? But the nature of information needed, we have some better data and a better sense of how to use it and why it's important to Indian country.
And I suspect that we'll see as we engage in future negotiated rulemakings with tribes, because now there are examples of using tribally certified data, that's something that will be considered again by the negotiating rulemaking team and specifically the tribes, and having that insight into how it actually has worked in practice, I think will be invaluable. So I see that down the road for at least the HUD funding programs.
Yeah, and I wanted to echo what Heidi said about the tribal data. There's a lot of different bills, including the Farm Bill, which authorizes USDA, that are up for reauthorization over the next 5 years. And I'm hoping that more and more tribes and more members of Congress start to incorporate that in legislation, right? Because I know at least at USDA, we have many cases in which it is very clear in the statute what data we can and cannot use. And therefore it prohibits us from using tribally authorized data. And so if we could start to build into more and more statutes the flexibility to use tribal data, that would be incredibly helpful. So in 5 years, I'm really hopeful that there will be additional flexibilities for use of tribal governmental data, just like we use state data and federal data for these different programs. And I'm also hopeful, in 5 years, as Jason pointed out, this geospatial data, I just can't emphasize it enough, I hope the census goes down, to the tribal level more. I hope our programs go down to the tribal governmental boundaries more. That really will make a huge difference in how we're able to service Indian country and to report out on how things are going and how the successes that we're seeing in Indian country.
I would say on the Treasury end, we would really like to see definitional clarity on a few items. One is tribal lands for the purposes of economic development, tribal socioeconomic indicators, and then also tribal government. So ARPA utilized a very unique definition of tribal government that was a modification of the List Act that included bans in parentheses. But if you are a tribal government that's a band that's not in parentheses, you're not separately eligible for payments. And so that's why in Treasury's materials, you'll sometimes see our eligible list of tribal governments changing from 579 to 582. And I think that that causes a lot of confusion in Indian country. And also it does dilute the pool of available resources when the number changes. So I think getting that number right is important with a clear definition to the departments. The second category is investment in tribal governments to collect data from what we've seen at Treasury, and we will continue to report this to Congress. Tribal governments collection of data that they don't annually collect is an unfunded mandate. Basically, they're doing the work for the federal government and they should be funded. And so to the greatest extent possible at Treasury, we will support tribal government staff and the data that we have about their capacity challenges, because I think the tribal government census and some of these other ideas may be the solution for the data we need. Tribes are the best suppliers of data about their citizens and lands.
Excellent. Well, we want to give you a chance to make any kind of final comments that you would like to, and as well as anything that you would want the audience to know about what you're doing around these issues, or ways in which, for example, us at the Center for Indian Country Development can be of assistance to you, or other researchers that are tuned in to our conversation today. So maybe I'll turn it over to Heather Dawn to start, and then folks can just jump in.
Just really grateful that you're paying attention to this issue and raising it to this level for this conversation. It's a real challenge. As many of you know, I'm not usually in the federal government, so this is new for me to be on this side of the aisle, if you will. And to see the huge gaps in the data has been a real challenge to do a good job on behalf of Indian country. And for Treasury in particular, I have a lot of empathy for it. I know it's been a hard 2 years to try and to implement these programs with these huge data gaps. So I am really grateful that the Harvard program has stepped up and really started to think creatively about how we can start to measure them, and appreciate that Indian country is becoming more trusting of us to think about these things together. Because as Fatima was saying, unless we trust each other about what the data is going to be used for, we're clear about how we're going to use it, and we start to measure them together and defer to tribal nations as the knowledge keepers of this information, we're not going to be able to move these policies forward in a really good and aggressive way. And I know that one of the biggest things that we are trying to do differently at USDA, as I pointed out, is really respect tribal sovereignty over your own lands, because we do have so many large infrastructure programs in our economic development portfolio. And that requires a whole different level of data that integrates maps, lands, and jurisdiction together. And so we really look forward to having challenging conversations with everybody about that to move forward in a good way on that and that geospatial intersection with data. So thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Could add on the Treasury, and thank you to CICD. I think the fact that CICD focuses on applied research is rare and is incredibly valuable for Indian country and the federal government. So we look forward at Treasury to continuing to work with CICD to support our mutual goals. And then I completely agree with Heather Dawn Thompson that I think evaluating the impacts of all the work that we're doing is incredibly important. At Treasury, we know we're in a unique spot during this administration, managing over 30 billion to Indian country. That can be a game changer if we make these programs accessible, flexible, and support tribes on the compliance end. And so that's our focus over these next 2 years, is to enable tribes to realize what these programs can be. Just in 1 year, 3,000 projects is only the start. And I think also identifying what is an issue and seeing it as surmountable. The fact that Treasury used census data under the CARES Act, was sued under ARPA, we engaged in consultation, we heard tribes, we worked with BIA, and now we distributed $20 billion off of tribal self-certified data. That's 2 years of a department making a massive change, and that's because of Indian country. So I think these problems that we're talking about are longstanding, but we can surmount them during our service in these administrations.
Yeah, and I would just thank everyone, my fellow colleagues on the panel too. We've had a great working relationship. Look forward to continuing to work together in the future. I did want to highlight that, you know, HUD has an Office of Policy Development and Research. We publish a learning agenda that we'd encourage everyone to look at. The current agenda, which gets updated periodically, has a number of projects to look at, including impacts of the Indian Housing Block Grant, competitive block grant program in tribal areas, as well as distinct impacts and challenges of climate change in tribal areas, and the effects of disaster recovery, mitigation, and adaptation strategies in tribal areas, all timely issues given the resources going to tribal communities to combat climate change and disaster. And really focusing around homelessness in Indian country, what that looks like, strategies for addressing, and the feasibility of developing local sources of building components and materials in tribal areas to reduce housing construction costs with inflation and the cost of materials going up. So those are both on the HUD user.gov webpage. So I'd encourage folks to look at that too, specifically geared towards Indian country.
Great, thank you, Heidi.
Great. No, I think my fellow panelists already covered the big issues pretty well. So I appreciate their comments. And it's great to be with them. And as Heidi said, we do have a great partnership going, you know, and that's one of the best things you can have in the federal government, is actually leveraging our efforts rather than colliding into each other, or at least passing ships through the night. So thanks to them for that. And thanks to Center for Indian Country Development for convening this, and again, ongoing partnerships. I think we all have a lot of great joint goals we can work on together. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. I have to say it's really been an honor to be part of this conversation with you all today. We know how busy you are. You have a lot on your plate and a lot of responsibility, and thank you for leading the way in your roles. And now I will turn it over to Casey Lozar.
Well, thank you, Roberta. And I also wanted to thank Heather Dawn, Jason, and Heidi and Fatima for helping us close out certainly a productive and an important set of conversations that we've had at the Research Summit the last couple of days. You know, there were a number of questions that we got throughout the course of the Research Summit. In regards to getting access to some of the presentations and the studies that were referenced across day 1 and day 2. And I just wanted to remind folks that not only will that information, but the recording of the Research Summit will be available on our website, the minneapolisfed.org/Indian country. It'll all be on the events page where the agenda was for the Research Summit. So to maybe kind of reflect on 2 days of incredible conversations, it really identified three primary themes that came from a wide variety of different topics that were explored. Really, the first is the advancements in addressing data needs in Indian country, data needs extending to data visibility, data quality, the capacity to collect and use data, and certainly tribal data sovereignty. And the conversation around data gaps certainly is evolving, and is evolving quite quickly. We're no longer just talking about the gaps themselves. We're now seeing and sharing real world examples of how we're addressing these needs in ways that really truly serve our tribal communities. We heard examples of this work across a lot of different levels. It's happening at our local Native communities, with federal agencies, as we just heard, and organizations like the Center for Indian Country Development, who are partnering with tribal communities to build geographically broad, meaningful data sets, like we heard from Elijah in regards to the Native Entity Enterprise data set. And Navajo Nation economist Alicia Murphy, she spoke eloquently about how data tells the stories of our communities. Alicia and other tribal leaders we heard from are really pioneering new ways of collecting data and safeguarding the data so that research can be done in good and meaningful ways. Not just to connect or collect the data, but to really use it to provide those services that are needed for our tribal families, our businesses, and our tribal communities. You know, another thing that I saw across the conversations was just a level of innovation and partnership in research. In addition to the examples that the tribal leaders shared of, you know, new data systems that they're developing, or review boards, or new ways of telling our stories through data, we also heard about groundbreaking work from rising researchers. The CICD's Elliot Charette, you know, a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, talked a lot about the shared innovative data on travel patterns during the pandemic, and how that was gathered from smartphones, or the information that Fatima Abbas just mentioned from Treasury about their innovative approach to use existing data, maybe imprecise data, but in meaningful ways to develop allocation methodologies that meet tribal communities where they're at. It's just exciting to hear the new ways of understanding our communities and overcoming some of the data scarcity issues that weren't previously available to us. Also, throughout our conversations about data, something else stood out, and that was the value of partnership. In one of yesterday's panels, economist Laurel Wheeler was joined by Forbans Community Fund's Lakota Vogel, the researcher and the practitioner coming together to share groundbreaking research that shows that financial institutions beyond Indian country can learn from the community and relationship-based practices of native CDFIs. And maybe the last central theme, sort of reflecting on the last couple of days with each other, is that we're talking about economic potential and economic prosperity in Indian country in a really holistic fashion. You know, in Indian country, economic development is community development, and community development is economic development. So when we talk about tribal economies, we're really talking about ecosystems that include many types of community infrastructure and our place and our culture. We heard from speakers like Mel Willey and Steve Barbier from NeighborWorks America, who helped us really consider what it means to advance tribal economies in this way, in a very holistic way at this point in time, and the role of home ownership in expanding tribal economic opportunity. It also takes many different roles and perspectives to effectively tap into the economic opportunities that exist in Indian country. And we heard from leaders, tribal leaders, from researchers, practitioners, federal policymakers, who are working to really advance economic prosperity in Indian country from a wide variety of different angles and different perspectives. You know, our entertainer for the summit, Jack Gladstone, had a comment or a quote. I thought it was very, very salient to sort of wrap up the 2022 CICD Research Summit. And he said, communication and coordination is essential in getting big things done in Indian country. And that was certainly underscored these last 2 days, that this principle certainly extends to our collective effort to unlock our full economic potential in Indian country. I wanted to send a special thanks to our team here at the Center for Indian Country Development for all their hard work in creating this meeting ground for all of us to share and to learn from each other. I want to thank the panelists and the moderators for some difficult and exciting conversations that made for an incredibly productive two days. So on behalf of our team here at the Federal Reserve, thank you all for attending the Research Summit, and we wish you a safe and restful holiday season. Lam Lam Spesia.